20-year-old girl walks into a biker clubhouse holding a list of names, names that should have stayed buried. Outside, snow falls across an empty highway, and somewhere in the frozen dark, a man who hasn't been seen in weeks is running out of time. The police gave up. The system turned its back, and the only people willing to help are the ones society already threw away, scarred, dangerous, and bound by a code no badge could ever understand. This is not a story about outlaws. This is a story about what happens when the ones who protect you are the ones the world forgot. Stay with me until the very end. This one's going to stay with you. If you're watching right now, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let's ride. The snow came in sideways that night, thick and mean, turning the highway into a white blur stretching toward nothing. Route 29 hadn't seen a snowplow in 6 hours. The county didn't bother with roads like this anymore. Roads that led to towns people pretended didn't exist. Leah Mercer drove a rusted-out Civic with a cracked windshield and one headlight that flickered like it was deciding whether to quit. Her fingers were stiff around the steering wheel. The heater had stopped working 2 weeks ago. She wore a coat she'd pulled from a Goodwill bin and boots with duct tape around the left sole, and the coffee in the cup holder had gone cold before she even left the driveway. She was 20 years old, and she looked like she hadn't slept in a month. Because she hadn't. Not really. Not since Edward disappeared. The radio crackled static. She turned it off and drove through the silence, watching the snow swallow the road ahead. Somewhere out there, past the dead factories and the boarded-up gas stations, her brother was either hiding or buried, and she was the only one still looking. Edward wasn't blood. He never had been. Leah had been placed with the Mercer family at age 7. A quiet couple in a quiet house at the edge of a quiet town that had a way of making people disappear without anyone asking why. Edward was already there. 14 years old, lanky, awkward, the kind of kid who fixed things with his hands because words never came out right. He taught her how to ride a bike in the gravel driveway. He walked her to school every morning for 3 years straight, even when the other kids called him weird. Even when he started showing up with bruises, he wouldn't explain. They were never legally siblings. But when Leah woke up screaming from nightmares at age 9, it was Edward who sat outside her bedroom door until she stopped shaking. He never knocked. He never came in. He just sat there, and somehow that was enough. Now he was gone. And the silence he left behind was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. 3 weeks. 22 days, to be exact. Edward had missed his shift at the warehouse where he loaded pallets for $11 an hour. Missed it the next day, too. His landlord said his truck was still parked out front, keys on the kitchen counter, half a pot of coffee still sitting on the burner. His phone went straight to voicemail. The kind of voicemail that played a generic robot voice because Edward never bothered to record his own. Leah filed a missing persons report on day 3. The deputy behind the counter barely looked up from his computer screen. He typed slowly, asked her to spell Edward's last name twice, then told her most adults who disappear do it on purpose. He didn't disappear on purpose, Leah said. The deputy shrugged. People leave, ma'am, especially around here. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the top of his head, feeling something crack behind her ribs. Not grief, not yet, but the sharp edge of something worse. The understanding that she was alone in this, that no one was coming, that the system she'd been told to trust had looked at her brother's name and decided he wasn't worth the paperwork. She walked out of the station and sat in her car in the parking lot for 45 minutes. She didn't cry. She just stared at the snow piling on the windshield until the world outside turned white and formless. And then she started the engine and drove to the first place she could think of. The library. It was a sad building. Brick walls stained with decades of rain. A leaking roof patched with blue tarps. Half the lights inside were burned out, and the ones still working flickered in a way that made the aisles feel like something out of a dream you'd rather forget. The librarian, an older woman named Gail, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked up from her desk and nodded without smiling. Back again? Gail said. Yeah. You eat today? Leah didn't answer. She walked past the front desk, past the children's section with its faded cartoon posters peeling off the walls, past the rows of outdated encyclopedias nobody touched anymore, and into the back corner where the maintenance and municipal records gathered dust on metal shelves that hadn't been wiped down since the building was new. This was where she'd been spending her nights, pulling old records, town council minutes, business permits, anything that might tell her something, anything, about why Edward might have run, or who might have made him. She didn't have a plan. She had desperation, and desperation had a way of making you thorough. She reached for a thick maintenance manual wedged between two binders on the top shelf. It was heavy, filled with outdated diagrams of the town's water system. She'd flipped through it before and found nothing. But tonight, as she opened it under the dull fluorescent light, something shifted between the yellowed pages. A folded stack of papers, thin, handwritten, tucked deep inside the spine like someone wanted them found, but only by the right person. Leia's hands trembled as she unfolded them. Names, dozens of names, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, the kind that came from someone who wanted to be careful. Some she recognized. Gerald Briggs, the old man who ran the hardware store on Maple. Connie Faust, who taught third grade at the elementary school before she retired early and stopped leaving her house. Danny Reeves, who owned the mechanic shop off Route 29 and once changed Leia's tire for free because she looked like she was about to cry. Others she didn't know at all. Names from neighboring towns. Names with phone numbers scratched beside them. Names with small notations in the margins. Dates, addresses, shorthand she couldn't decipher. But at the bottom of the last page, circled twice in blue ink, was a name she knew better than her own. Edward Mercer. Her breath caught. The library hummed around her, pipes groaning in the walls, wind pressing against the windows. She stared at his name until the letters blurred, then folded the papers carefully and slid them into her coat pocket. She didn't tell Gail. She didn't tell anyone. She walked out into the snow and stood beside her car, her breath making small ghosts in the frozen air, and felt the weight of the papers against her chest like a second heartbeat. She had no idea what the list meant, but she knew one thing with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold. Someone had written Edward's name on a list and hidden it in a place where only the desperate would look, and that meant someone knew what happened to him. The question was whether they were trying to help or whether they were keeping score. She drove for 40 minutes through the storm. The snow had thickened, and the world outside her windshield had turned into a tunnel of white noise and darkness. She almost missed the turn, a narrow gravel road that cut off the highway and wound through a patch of dead trees before opening up to a compound of low concrete buildings, corrugated metal fences, and a hand-painted sign bolted above a steel gate. Black Veil Riders, MC. She'd heard about them. Everyone in town had. They were the kind of men people crossed the street to avoid. Leather cuts, loud bikes, faces that looked like they'd been carved out of bad years and worse decisions. The rumors ranged from drug running to gun smuggling to flat-out murder, depending on who was talking and how many drinks they'd had. Leia had never spoken to any of them. She'd seen them sometimes, parked outside the diner on Route 29, their Harleys lined up like metal wolves sleeping in the sun. She'd seen the way people looked at them, half fear, half disgust, the kind of expression reserved for things you didn't understand and didn't want to. But 3 of the names on the list belonged to members of the Black Veil Riders. She'd recognized their road names scrawled in the margins: Wrench, Deacon, Cade. She didn't have a plan. She hadn't called ahead. She didn't even know if they'd let her through the gate. But nobody else had listened. She parked her Civic beside a row of Harleys caked with snow and road salt, killed the engine, and sat there for a full minute, listening to the wind howl against the car. Her hands were shaking. Not from cold. From the kind of fear that lives in the space between knowing you should leave and knowing you can't. She got out. The compound was louder than she expected. Music thumped from somewhere inside. Something low and heavy, all bass and no melody. A pair of pit bulls chained near the entrance lifted their heads and watched her with flat, disinterested eyes. 2 men stood near a barrel fire by the main building's entrance, smoke curling from their cigarettes, their faces half lit by the orange glow. One of them, thick-necked, shaved head, a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, looked at her and didn't blink. "You lost?" he said. "No," Leia said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm looking for whoever's in charge." The scarred man glanced at the other one. Something passed between them. Not words, just a flicker of recognition, the way people communicate when they've been through enough together to stop needing language. "Inside," the scarred man said. He nodded toward the door. "Don't touch nothing." The clubhouse smelled like motor oil, stale beer, and cigarette smoke that had soaked into the walls so deep it had become part of the architecture. Neon beer signs cast red and blue light across a concrete floor scuffed with boot marks. A pool table sat in the corner, balls scattered mid-game. A jukebox glowed in the far wall, playing something country and sad. Leather jackets hung from hooks near the door like the shed skins of something dangerous. 15, maybe 20 people filled the room, men and women. Some sitting at a long wooden bar, some standing in clusters, some leaning against walls with their arms crossed. They were big and scarred and tired looking, the kind of people who wore their damage on their faces and didn't bother hiding it. Every single one of them turned to look at Laya when she walked in. The music didn't stop, but the conversation did. The silence hit like a wave, not empty, but full, pressurized, the kind that pushes against your skin. Laya's boots stuck slightly to the floor as she stepped forward. She could feel their eyes on her, measuring, calculating, deciding whether she was a threat, or a joke, or something in between. Her hand went to her coat pocket. She felt the papers there, folded and warm from her body heat. A woman emerged from the back of the room. She was maybe 50, maybe older, the kind of face where age stopped mattering because life had done more damage than years ever could. Dark hair streaked with gray, pulled back tight. A scar along her collarbone, visible above the neckline of a black shirt. Her eyes were the color of river stones, and they moved across Laya's face with the slow precision of someone who had learned a long time ago how to read people the way other people read books. This was Mara Vale, president of the Black Veil Riders, a title she'd earned not through blood or birthright, but through 23 years of holding together a club that the world had tried to bury more times than she could count. She'd buried a husband. She'd buried a son. She walked with a slight limp from a wreck on I-40 that should have killed her, and she spoke with the kind of quiet authority that made loud men go silent. "You the one asking about Edward Mercer?" Mara said. Laya blinked. "How did you—" "Small town," Mara said. "Sit down." It wasn't a question. Laya sat. Someone placed a mug of coffee in front of her, black, scalding, in a chipped ceramic mug with the club's logo faded on the side. She wrapped both hands around it and felt warmth seep into her fingers for the first time in hours. Mara sat across from her. Behind Mara, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, was a man who hadn't moved since Laya entered the room. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with a lean, hard build and a face that looked like it had been assembled from granite and regret. Dark hair cut short, a faded military tattoo on his forearm, eyes that tracked everything and gave away nothing. Cade Rayner, ex-Marine, 3 tours overseas, the kind of man who came home and discovered that the country he'd fought for didn't have a place for him anymore. He hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to anyone tonight, and that was considered a chatty evening for him. "Talk," Mara said. Laya pulled the papers from her coat and unfolded them on the table. The names spread across the scarred wood like a confession. "I found this in the library," Laya said, "hidden inside a manual on the back shelf. My brother's name is on it. 3 of your people are on it too." Mara didn't touch the papers. She looked at them the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, calm, clinical, already calculating what's broken and what it'll cost to fix. The room had gone so quiet, Laya could hear the neon sign buzzing above the bar. "You're all on this list," Laya said, louder this time, loud enough for the room. "And I need to know why." A murmur rippled through the clubhouse. Someone near the pool table set down a bottle with a heavy thud. A woman with close-cropped hair and oil-stained hands pushed off the wall and took a step forward, then stopped when Mara raised a single finger. Cade unfolded his arms. He didn't speak. He just leaned forward slightly, and the weight of his attention fell on Laya like a physical thing. Mara picked up one of the pages. Her eyes moved slowly down the column of names. Laya watched her face and saw something shift beneath the surface. Not surprise, not fear, but recognition. The kind of look that said she'd been waiting for this, maybe dreading it. "Where exactly did you find this?" Mara asked. Her voice was quieter now. "Maintenance manual, back shelf, second row from the top, tucked inside the spine." "Anyone else know you have it?" "No." "You sure about that?" Laya hesitated. She thought about the library, the flickering lights, the empty aisles, the way the back door had been propped open with a brick when she left, even though she was certain it had been closed when she arrived. "I don't know," she admitted. Mara set the paper down and looked at Cade. Something passed between them. Not words, not a signal, but the kind of understanding that exists between people who have survived enough together that communication has been stripped down to its barest elements. A look, a shift, a decision made in silence. "You shouldn't have come here," Mara said. But she said it the way someone says be careful, not as a warning to leave, but as an acknowledgement that staying would cost something. "I don't have anywhere else to go," Leia said. And the truth of it landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Mara studied her for a long time. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand, rough, calloused, scarred across the knuckles, over Leia's. "Then you're in the right place," Mara said. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls, and somewhere in the compound a dog barked once and went silent. That was the night everything changed. Not with an explosion, not with a chase, but with a list of names spread across a biker's table and a girl who had run out of places to turn. Cade moved first. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled a road map from a drawer behind the bar. The real kind, paper, creased from use, with routes marked in red pen and locations circled in black. He spread it beside the list and began cross-referencing names with addresses, his finger tracing lines between towns with the focus of a man who had spent years reading terrain maps in places where a wrong turn meant a body bag. 6 of these people are within 50 miles, he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel under tires. The first full sentence Leia had heard him speak. "And the others?" Mara asked. "Scattered. Some of these towns don't even have working post offices anymore." Mara turned to Leia. "Your brother. When's the last time you actually talked to him?" "Not texted. Talked." Leia swallowed. 5 weeks ago. He called me from a payphone, said he needed to tell me something, but not over the phone. We were supposed to meet at the diner on Route 29 that Friday." She paused. "He never showed." "A payphone," Cade repeated. He said it like a diagnosis. "He was scared," Leia said. "I could hear it in his voice. Edward doesn't scare easy. When we were kids, he once walked into a barn full of copperheads to pull out a stray dog. He didn't even flinch." Her voice cracked. "But on that call, he sounded like a different person." The clubhouse felt smaller now, like the walls had drawn in. Someone had turned off the jukebox. The only sounds were the wind outside, the occasional clink of a bottle, and the low hum of the neon signs bleeding color across the room. A man at the bar, heavy, bearded, wearing a leather cut with the name Wrench stitched across the chest, cleared his throat. "I know that name. Mercer. He was loading at the Colton Road warehouse, right? Off the books shifts?" Leia nodded. "He needed the money." Wrench exchanged a look with Mara. "I did some side work there last spring. Brake jobs, fluid changes on the fleet trucks. I stopped going back after they asked me to work nights and wouldn't say what they were hauling." "What do you think they were hauling?" Leia asked. Wrench looked into his beer. "Nothing that comes with a manifest." The implication hung in the air like cigarette smoke, heavy, impossible to ignore, settling into everything it touched. Mara stood. The room straightened with her, a subconscious response from people who had learned that when Mara Vale stood, something was about to happen. "I want 2 teams," she said. "Wrench, take Bowie and Jules. Start with Gerald Briggs. His hardware store is 10 minutes from here. If anyone on this list is still talking, it's him. Cade, you're with me. We'll take the southern names." She looked at Leia. "You ride?" "I drive," Leia said. "I don't have a bike." "You ride with Cade," Mara said. Not a suggestion, not an offer. A statement of fact, delivered with the casual authority of someone who had long ago stopped asking for permission or consensus. Cade said nothing. He pulled a spare helmet from a shelf near the door and held it out to Leia without looking at her. It was scuffed and faded, with a hairline crack along the left side. Someone had worn this helmet before. Someone who wasn't here anymore. Leia took it. "We leave at dawn," Mara said. "Get some sleep. Couch in the back room's got blankets." Leia hesitated. I barely know. You walked into a biker clubhouse alone at midnight, carrying a list of names that could get people killed, Mara said, cutting her off. "You've already made your choice. Now rest. Tomorrow's going to be long." Leia lay on the couch in the back room with her coat still on and her boots still laced, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The blanket smelled like motor oil and old fabric softener. Through the thin walls she could hear the low murmur of voices. Mara and Cade, still talking, their words too quiet to make out, but their tones heavy with the kind of weight that comes from conversations about things that can't be undone. She pulled out her phone. No new messages. No missed calls. Edward's contact photo stared back at her, a candid shot from last summer, him squinting against the sun outside the diner, half smiling, a grease stain on his cheek. He looked young. He looked alive. She pressed the phone to her chest and closed her eyes. When she opened them, gray light was pressing through the windows, and the sound of motorcycle engines filled the compound like a low, rolling thunder. She sat up, heart hammering, disoriented, her breath visible in the cold air. Someone had left a fresh mug of coffee on the floor beside the couch. Still warm. She picked it up, took a long sip, and felt it burn a line of heat down her chest. Outside, the compound was alive. Bikes were being rolled out of the garage, engines turning over with deep, guttural snarls. Men and women in leather cuts moved with purpose, checking tires, adjusting mirrors, strapping gear to saddlebags. The snow had stopped, but the sky was the color of iron, and the wind carried the sharp bite of more storms coming. Cade was already on his bike, a matte black Harley-Davidson Road King, with no chrome, no flash, no decoration of any kind. A machine stripped to its essentials, like the man who rode it. He sat motionless, hands on his thighs, staring straight ahead. Mara stood beside her own bike, a Heritage Softail, dark green, the only splash of color in the compound. She was zipping her jacket and talking to Wrench, who was nodding and gesturing toward the east road. Leia stepped into the cold and crossed the gravel toward Cade. He didn't turn. She climbed onto the back of the bike, the leather seat cold through her jeans, and fumbled with the helmet strap. Cade reached back without looking and adjusted the strap with one hand. His fingers were rough and quick, and the gesture was so automatic, so devoid of thought, that Leia understood it immediately. He had done this before. For someone else. Someone who used to sit where she was sitting now. She didn't ask. Some questions you learn to leave alone. Some answers live in the silence between people, and pulling them into the light does nothing but cause pain. "Hold on," Cade said. 2 words. No inflection, just instruction. She wrapped her arms around his midsection and felt the solidity of him. Not warmth exactly, but presence. The physical reality of a person who was not going to disappear. After weeks of emptiness, of calling numbers that didn't answer, and knocking on doors that stayed shut, the simple act of holding on to another human being nearly broke her. The engines roared. The convoy pulled out of the compound. 6 bikes in formation, Mara at the front, Cade behind her, the others flanking in a V-shape that cut through the gray morning like something ancient and deliberate. Leia looked back once. The clubhouse grew smaller behind them, the neon signs dark in the daylight, the pit bulls watching from beside the barrel fire. Then the highway opened up, and the world became wind and engine noise in the long, empty stretch of road ahead. The first stop was Gerald Briggs's hardware store, a sagging building on Main Street with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Briggs & Sons." Since 1974. The Sons part was a ghost. Gerald's 2 boys had both left town before they turned 20. One joined the military, the other just vanished. Gerald didn't talk about either of them. The store was open but barely alive. Half the shelves were empty. A fluorescent light in the back aisle stuttered and buzzed. Gerald stood behind the counter, 70 years old, white-haired, wearing a flannel shirt buttoned to the neck and an expression that looked like it had been carved from the same wood as the floorboards. He watched the bikers walk in and said nothing. His hand drifted beneath the counter. "Easy, Gerald," Mara said. "We're not here for trouble." "Then why are you here?" His voice was thin but steady. Leia stepped forward. She placed the list on the counter. Gerald's eyes dropped to the paper. He went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of a man who had been dreading a specific moment for a very long time and had just watched it arrive. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "The library." His hand came up from beneath the counter, empty. He placed both palms flat on the glass surface and leaned forward, staring at the list like it was a letter from the dead. "I told them," he said quietly. "I told them someone would find it eventually." "Told who?" Mara asked. Gerald looked up. His eyes were wet, but his jaw was set. "The others. The ones who saw things. The ones who tried to talk. He tapped the list with a trembling finger. Every name on this paper, every single one, is someone who noticed something they weren't supposed to, and every single one of them paid for it. The fluorescent light buzzed and flickered. Paid how? Leia asked. Gerald Briggs reached beneath the counter again, slower this time, and pulled out a shoebox. It was old, dented, held shut with a rubber band. He set it on the counter and slid it toward Mara. Open it, he said. Mara removed the rubber band and lifted the lid. Inside, photographs. Dozens of them. Blurry shots of trucks parked behind warehouses at night. License plates from 3 different states. Men in uniforms. Not military, but municipal. Inspectors. Deputies. People who were supposed to enforce the law, captured on film doing something that clearly wasn't law enforcement. And at the bottom of the box, a single Polaroid. A young man standing in a parking lot, looking over his shoulder with an expression of pure, undiluted terror. Leia's knees went weak. It was Edward. The timestamp on the Polaroid was dated 6 days before he disappeared, and written on the white strip at the bottom, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were 4 words that turned her blood to ice. He saw too much. Leia couldn't feel her legs. She stood in Gerald Briggs' hardware store, staring at the Polaroid of her brother, his face caught mid-turn, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, the parking lot behind him washed in the yellow haze of a sodium lamp, and the world narrowed to a single point of light surrounded by darkness. He saw too much. 4 words. Someone else's handwriting. Blue ink, pressed hard into the white strip, the letters slightly slanted like they'd been written in a hurry, or in anger, or both. Mara took the Polaroid from Leia's trembling hand. She held it under the stuttering fluorescent light and studied it without expression, the way a field medic studies a wound. Not flinching, not reacting, just calculating depth and damage, and whether there was still time. When was this taken? Mara asked Gerald. I don't know exactly. It showed up in my mailbox about 4 weeks ago. No envelope, no note, just that. Gerald's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. I thought it was a warning. Keep your mouth shut or you're next. Next after what? Cade said from the doorway. He hadn't come inside. He stood with his back against the frame, arms crossed, watching the street through the glass door like a man who expected trouble to arrive in a vehicle. Gerald looked at him. You know damn well after what? The silence that followed was heavy enough to bruise. Mara set the Polaroid down on the counter and spread the rest of the photographs beside it. Trucks, license plates. Men in uniforms loading boxes into vans behind a warehouse Leia recognized. The long corrugated building on Colton Road where Edward had worked those off-the-books shifts. Gerald, Mara said, how long have you been sitting on this? 8 months. 8 months. Mara repeated it flatly, not a question, an indictment. Gerald's jaw tightened. What was I supposed to do? Call the sheriff? Half those pictures have his deputies in them. Call the state police? They routed me to a voicemail that nobody checks. I wrote letters, 3 of them. Never got a response. He slammed his palm on the counter, and the photographs jumped. I'm 70 years old. I got no sons, no wife, and a store that's bleeding money. Who the hell was going to listen to me? We would have, Mara said. You. Gerald let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Last time I talked to one of your people, it was Deacon, and he told me to mind my own business. The name landed in the room like a dropped blade. Leia saw Mara's eyes change, just for a second, just a flicker, but it was there. Something raw and unguarded, gone before it could be named. Deacon said that? Mara's voice had gone very quiet. 6 months ago, I showed him one of those pictures, and he looked me in the eye and said, some things are better left buried. Then he walked out. Gerald pointed a bony finger at Mara. Your man, your club. So don't stand in my store and tell me you would have listened. Mara didn't respond. She gathered the photographs into a neat stack, placed them back in the shoebox, and tucked the box under her arm. Her face had closed like a door. Whatever she was feeling, it was locked away now, stored in whatever vault she kept the things that could hurt her. We're listening now, she said. That's going to have to be enough. She walked out. Cade stepped aside to let her pass, and Leia saw him glance at Mara's face as she moved through the doorway. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. Whatever the name Deacon meant to this club, it was a wound that hadn't healed. Leia grabbed the Polaroid of Edward before following them out. She slipped it into her coat pocket beside the list, and the weight of both pressed against her ribs, like evidence at a trial she hadn't been invited to. The ride back to the compound was 20 minutes of frozen silence and engine noise. Leia pressed her face against Cade's back to shield herself from the wind, and she could feel the tension in his body, the rigid set of his spine, the way his shoulders stayed locked even on the straightaways. Whatever Gerald had said about Deacon had changed something. The air between Mara and Cade, which had hummed with wordless coordination that morning, now felt brittle. By the time they pulled into the compound, the sky had darkened to a bruised purple, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Wrench and his team were already back, their bikes parked in a crooked line by the garage. Wrench sat on an overturned milk crate, smoking, his face unreadable. "Anything?" Mara said as she swung off her bike. Wrench exhaled smoke through his nose. "Connie Faust won't open her door. Literally. We stood on her porch for 20 minutes. She talked through the chain lock, said she doesn't know anything, doesn't want to know anything, and if we come back, she's calling the cops." He flicked ash into the gravel. "She was shaking, Mara. Through the crack in the door, I could see her hands. She was shaking like a dog in a thunderstorm." "What about Danny Reeves?" Wrench's expression shifted. "That's the thing. Danny's shop is closed, permanently. The windows are boarded up. Somebody spray-painted snitch across the front door in red." He paused. "His neighbor said Danny packed up and left town 3 weeks ago, middle of the night. Didn't tell anyone where he was going." 3 weeks ago. The same time frame as Edward's disappearance. Leia felt the connection hit her like a punch to the sternum. She leaned against Cade's bike, her hand on the cold metal, trying to breathe through the sudden vertigo of understanding that her brother wasn't the only one who had been erased. "We need to talk about Deacon," Mara said. The compound went quiet. Not the natural quiet of people finishing a conversation, but the hard, sudden quiet of people who've just heard something they've been avoiding for a long time. Wrench looked at his cigarette. Jules, a wiry woman with a shaved head and tattoo sleeves covering both arms, stopped mid-step. Bowie, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, set down the wrench he'd been using and straightened slowly. "Inside," Mara said. They filed into the clubhouse. Someone turned on the overhead lights, bare bulbs that cast harsh white circles on the concrete floor. The jukebox stayed off. The neon signs hummed, but their glow felt cold now, stripped of whatever thin warmth they'd provided the night before. Mara stood at the head of the long wooden table. She placed the shoebox in front of her. Cade took his usual position against the wall, but closer to the door this time, like a man who wanted an exit. "Gerald Briggs says Deacon told him to keep quiet about what he saw, 6 months ago." Mara scanned the room. "Anyone want to tell me why I'm hearing about this now?" "Nothing." "I didn't ask the room," Mara said. "I asked specific people." Her eyes settled on Wrench. "You and Deacon ran supply routes together for 2 years. You telling me he never mentioned Gerald?" Wrench rubbed his jaw. "Deacon didn't talk about his runs. You know that. He was—" He stopped. Chose a different word. "Private." "Private and telling a witness to shut up are 2 different things." "Mara, where is he?" The question fell like a gavel. Wrench looked at Jules. Jules looked at Bowie. Bowie stared at the table. "He left," Bowie said finally. "About 4 months ago. Said he needed space. Rode south. That's all I know." "That's all you know," Mara repeated. "Your road partner for 7 years rides off in the middle of the night, and all you know is south." "He wasn't my road partner anymore." Bowie's voice was heavy. "Not after what happened with Wren." The name hit the room like a shockwave. Leia didn't know who Wren was, but she could feel the impact, could see it in the way Wrench closed his eyes, the way Jules turned her face toward the wall, the way Cade's hands curled into fists at his sides, and then slowly, deliberately, uncurled. Mara's composure cracked, just for a moment, just enough for Leia to see what was underneath. Not anger, not authority, but grief. Old grief. The kind that gets woven into your posture, that changes the way you hold your head and the way you breathe. "We're not talking about Wren," Mara said, and her voice was a blade wrapped in cotton. "We're talking about Deacon. And we're talking about whether one of our own helped bury evidence of a crime that got people run out of their homes." "We don't know that's what happened," Wrench said. "Then what do you think happened?" "I think Deacon got scared, Same as Gerald, same as Connie Faust, same as Danny Reeves, same as every name on that list. Wrench leaned forward, elbows on the table. You want to make him a villain? Go ahead. But fear isn't betrayal, Mara. You of all people should know that. The silence that followed was the kind that ruins friendships. Long, acidic, full of things that couldn't be taken back. Mara looked at Wrench for a long moment. Then she turned to Leia. You should know something, Mara said. Deacon's real name is Marcus Webb. He was a founding member of this club, 20 years. And right now I don't know if he's someone who got scared and ran, or someone who's been protecting the people who took your brother. Leia's chest constricted. You think one of your own is involved? I think I don't have the luxury of trust right now. Mara pulled a photograph from the shoebox to one of the shots of men loading trucks behind the Colton Road warehouse. She turned it toward the room. Look at the man on the right, the one by the cab. Leia squinted. The image was grainy, taken at night, probably from a distance, but the man by the truck cab was wearing a leather vest, and on the back of that vest, blurred but unmistakable, was a patch, a Black Veil Rider's patch. The room erupted, not in shouts. These weren't people who shouted, but in the low volcanic rumble of voices talking over each other, of chairs scraping concrete, of hands hitting the table. Jules cursed under her breath. Bowie stood up so fast his chair fell over behind him. Wrench stared at the photograph like it had personally betrayed him. That could be anyone, Wrench said. That could be a stolen cut. You know people fake patches. I know what I see, Mara said. You see what you want to see. Careful. Mara's voice dropped to a register Leia hadn't heard before, low, vibrating with something close to danger. You don't get to tell me what I see in my own house. Cade moved. It was subtle. He didn't step forward, didn't uncross his arms, didn't change his expression, but he shifted his weight from the wall to his feet, and that shift carried enough implicit force to quiet the room. Everyone knew what Cade had been before the club. Everyone knew what those hands had done in places with no names. The reminder didn't need to be spoken. We find Deacon, Cade said. We ask him. And if he doesn't want to be found, Wrench asked, then that tells us something too. Leia sat at the table long after the meeting broke apart, staring at the photographs spread across the wood. The clubhouse emptied slowly around her, bikers drifting to their rooms, to the garage, to the barrel fire outside where conversations happened in smoke and half sentences. She could hear Wrench arguing with Jules in the hallway, their voices low and sharp, the words indistinct, but the anger clear. She picked up the photograph with the Black Veil Rider's patch. She held it close, studying the figure by the truck. The build was medium. The face was turned away. The patch was the only identifier. And patches could be stolen, could be faked, could be planted, but they could also be worn by someone who belonged. You're thinking too hard. Leia looked up. Cade stood across the table, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He set one in front of her and kept the other. His face was as closed as ever, but there was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Not warmth exactly, but proximity. The look of someone who had decided, against their better judgment, to stand close enough to get hurt. How do you know I'm thinking too hard? Because you've been staring at that picture for 40 minutes, and your coffee's been empty for 30. She almost smiled. Almost. Cade, who's Ren? He went still. The mug in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, carefully. The way you set down something you're afraid of breaking. Ren was Mara's son. Leia's breath caught. He rode with us for 3 years, smart kid, too smart for this life, but he loved it anyway. Loved the road, loved the club, loved being part of something. Cade paused. His jaw worked silently, grinding through a pain that had no words. He died 2 years ago, wreck on the river bridge outside Dalton. His bike hit a patch of black ice at 60 miles an hour. I'm sorry. Deacon was riding behind him, saw the whole thing, couldn't do anything. Cade picked up his mug again. After that, Deacon changed, got quiet, got distant. Started taking runs alone, coming back late, not talking to anyone for days. Mara tried to reach him. We all did. But whatever he saw on that bridge, it broke something in him that couldn't be fixed with conversation. Leia absorbed this. The grief in this club wasn't abstract. It was structural, load-bearing, woven into the foundation. Every interaction she'd witnessed, every loaded silence, every look exchanged across the room, it all made sense now. These people were held together not by loyalty alone, but by shared loss. And shared loss, she was learning, could be a bond or a fracture depending on how you carried it. You think Deacon's involved in what happened to Edward? She asked. Cade looked at her. I think Deacon's a man who watched someone he loved die and decided the world owed him permission to stop caring. And people who stop caring are dangerous, not because they're evil, because they're empty. He picked up his mug, drained it, and walked out without another word. His boots echoed on the concrete floor, steady and even. The footsteps of a man who had learned to walk away from things he couldn't carry. Not because he was weak, but because he'd already been crushed by the weight of trying. Leia sat alone in the clubhouse. The neon signs buzzed, the wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere outside, an engine turned over and idled, the low rumble vibrating through the walls like a heartbeat. She looked at the photographs again. Trucks, warehouses, men in uniforms, a biker patch in the dark, and somewhere beneath all of it, Edward, caught in a web he'd stumbled into by accident, woven by people who'd been operating in this town long before she was born. She thought about what Gerald had said. 8 months of evidence, 3 unanswered letters, a man too old and too tired to fight alone. She thought about Connie Faust shaking behind her chain lock. She thought about Danny Reeves' spray-painted door. Snitch. The word itself was a weapon, designed to isolate, to silence, to turn survival into shame. These weren't random acts. This was a system, a machine built to grind down anyone who looked too close, anyone who asked the wrong question, anyone who stood in the wrong parking lot at the wrong time and saw something that was never meant to be seen. Edward had been one of them, and now Leia was becoming another. The next morning arrived with freezing rain and bad news. Wrench found it first, a note pinned to the gate of the compound with a hunting knife. No envelope, no signature. Just a single sheet of paper with words cut from a newspaper and glued in crooked lines, the way threats are made in movies. Except this wasn't a movie, and the knife was real and driven deep enough into the wood that Wrench needed both hands to pull it out. Stop asking questions. Next one goes through a window, not the buildings. Mara read it once, folded it, put it in her pocket. Double the watch tonight, she said to Cade. Nobody rides alone until I say otherwise. You're not going to tell the others? Leia asked. They'll see the knife hole in the gate. They'll figure it out. Mara looked at her. Fear is a contagion, Leia. You introduce it wrong and it spreads faster than whatever you're fighting. These people know what danger looks like. They don't need me to narrate it. But the damage was already spreading in other ways. By noon, 2 members had packed their saddlebags and ridden out without saying goodbye. A third, a young mechanic named Stokes, who'd been prospecting for less than a year, told Jules he had family in Michigan and needed to clear his head for a while. Jules let him go without argument, but Leia saw the look on her face as Stokes' bike disappeared down the highway. Not anger, but the quiet devastation of someone watching a thing they built begin to crack. Rats leaving the ship, Bowie muttered from beside the barrel fire. They're not rats, Jules said sharply. They're scared. Same result. No, Jules said. It's not. And if you can't tell the difference, you've been in this club too long or not long enough. Bowie looked at her for a long moment, then went back to staring at the fire. That afternoon, Leia found herself in the garage, sitting on a workbench while Cade stripped and cleaned a carburetor with the focused precision of a man performing surgery. The radio played low. Country, scratchy, some song about losing things on back roads. Rain hammered the metal roof. Can I ask you something? Leia said. You're going to anyway. The night I came here, Mara already knew my name. She knew about Edward. How? Cade didn't look up. His hands moved over the carburetor parts, fingers black with grease, a rag draped over his shoulder. Mara knows everything that happens in a 40-mile radius. She's got people in diners, in gas stations, in the county clerk's office. Not spies. Just people who owe her favors. People she helped when no one else would. Helped how? Connie Faust's husband used to hit her. Mara showed up at their house one night with 4 members and had a conversation with him. He moved to Ohio the next week. He paused. Gerald's store was going under 3 years ago. Mara organized a community buy-in, got 30 people to commit to shopping local. Didn't put her name on it. Didn't ask for credit. He set down a gasket and looked at Leia for the first time. That's who she is. And that's why this thing with Deacon is eating her alive. Because she trusted him. And trust in this world is the most expensive thing you can give. Do you trust her? Cade held her gaze. I'd die for her. That's not the same thing, but it's close enough. The rain intensified. Somewhere in the compound, a shutter banged against a wall. Cade went back to his work, and Leia sat in the sound of rain and radio static, turning his words over in her mind like stones pulled from a riverbed. Smooth, cold, heavy with meaning she wasn't sure she fully understood. At 9 o'clock that night, a sound cut through the compound that made every person stop breathing. Not the rumble of a Harley, not the crack of a gunshot, the crunch of tires on gravel, slow, deliberate. A vehicle approaching with its headlights off. Cade was on his feet before the sound registered in Leia's conscious mind. He moved through the clubhouse like something released from a cage, controlled, silent, every step calibrated. He pulled a shotgun from behind the bar and racked it with one smooth motion. The sound echoed through the room like a sentence. Mara appeared from the back hallway, already jacketed, already alert. She didn't speak. She pointed 2 fingers at Wrench and then at the side door. Wrench moved. She pointed at Jules and gestured toward the roof access. Jules moved. 20 years of drills, of late-night alarms, of never knowing which set of headlights carried friendly faces and which carried the end of everything. It had turned them into a machine that operated on instinct and trust. Leia stood in the center of the room, frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs. Stay here, Cade said from the doorway. He didn't look back. She stayed. She stood in the blue-red glow of the neon signs, listening to the rain on the roof and the crunch of gravel growing louder, and she pressed her hand against the Polaroid in her pocket like a talisman. Then the sound stopped. Engine off. A door opened and closed. One door, one person. Footsteps on gravel, slow, uneven. The gait of someone who was either injured or exhausted or both. Mara's voice carried through the rain from the compound entrance, sharp enough to cut glass. Stop right there. Hands where I can see them. A pause. Then a voice Leia didn't recognize. Male, rough, stripped raw, the kind of voice that comes from days of not sleeping and not eating and not stopping. It's me, Mara. Another pause. Longer this time. Long enough for the rain to fill it. Deacon? Mara said. And for the first time since Leia had known her, Mara Vale sounded uncertain. Leia moved to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, lit by the faint glow of the barrel fire, she saw him. A man in a soaked leather vest, standing in the middle of the compound with his hands raised, rain running down his face. He was thin, thinner than the vest was built for, and his posture had the broken geometry of someone who had been running for a long time and had finally stopped because there was nowhere left to go. Cade stepped out of the shadows with the shotgun leveled. Give me one reason, Cade said. I know where Edward Mercer is, Deacon said. The rain fell harder. Nobody moved. And I know who put him there. Leia's hand found the door handle. She pushed it open and stepped into the rain, cold water hitting her face like a slap. And she walked toward the man who might be a traitor or a witness or both. And she didn't care which one because he had just said the only words in the world that mattered. Mara raised her hand. Cade didn't lower the shotgun. Inside, Mara said to Deacon. Now. They brought him into the clubhouse like a prisoner, not in handcuffs, but in the cold geometry of bodies positioned to block every exit. Wrench stood by the side door. Jules came down from the roof and took the back hallway. Bowie sat at the bar with a tire iron resting across his knees, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, his face set in the expression of a man who had already decided how this was going to end and was just waiting for permission. Deacon sat at the table. Someone put coffee in front of him. He didn't touch it. His hands lay flat on the wood, palms down, fingers spread. A gesture of surrender, or of showing he had nothing to hide, or maybe both. His face was gaunt. His eyes were sunk deep into their sockets, ringed with the purple-black of chronic sleeplessness. A cut above his left eyebrow had scabbed over and then split open again, and a thin line of dried blood traced down his temple like a crack in porcelain. Mara sat across from him. Cade stood behind her with the shotgun broken open over his arm, unloaded now, but present, a reminder of what was possible. You've been gone 4 months, Mara said. I know. Gerald Briggs says you told him to keep his mouth shut. Deacon closed his eyes. I know. There's a photograph of someone wearing our patch loading trucks at the Colton Road warehouse. Deacon opened his eyes. He looked at Mara, and Leia saw something pass between them. Not the silent coordination she'd seen between Mara and Cade, but something older, something tangled with history and hurt, and the specific kind of betrayal that only comes from people who once meant everything to each other. "That was me," Deacon said. The clubhouse went dead. Not quiet. Dead. The kind of silence that exists after an explosion, when the air itself has been shocked into stillness. Wrench took a step forward. Bowie's hand tightened on the tire iron. "Explain," Mara said, one word, flat as a blade. 8 months ago, a man named Harlan Goss approached me outside the diner on Route 29. Said he knew about Wren. Said he knew about the wreck on the river bridge. Deacon's voice was mechanical, reciting facts like a man giving a deposition. He said the black ice that night wasn't natural. Said someone had poured water across the road surface 3 hours before Wren's ride. Said he could prove it. The room didn't breathe. Mara's face had turned to stone. Beneath the stone, something was fracturing. Leia could see it in the way her fingers went white around the edge of the table, in the way her shoulders drew inward by a fraction of an inch, in the tiny muscle that jumped once at the corner of her jaw and then went still. He said if I helped move cargo, just a few runs, just enough to keep the pipeline flowing, he'd give me the proof. Names, dates, the person who ordered it. Deacon's voice cracked for the first time. He said someone killed your son, Mara, and he said he could tell me who. The neon signs buzzed. Rain hammered the roof. Somewhere outside, a chain clinked against a fence post in the wind. Mara stood up slowly. She placed both hands on the table and leaned forward until her face was less than a foot from Deacon's. "Did you believe him?" she whispered. Deacon's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to." "That's not what I asked." "Yes," Deacon said. "I believed him, and I was wrong. And by the time I figured out he was using me, I was already in too deep. I'd made runs. I'd been photographed. I'd told Gerald to stay quiet because I thought if the whole thing blew up before I got the proof, I'd lose the only chance to find out what happened to Wren." His voice broke entirely. "I did it for you. I know that doesn't matter. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I did it for you." Mara straightened. She looked at Deacon with an expression that Leia would remember for the rest of her life. Not hatred, not forgiveness, but the devastating clarity of a woman seeing the full shape of a betrayal committed in the name of love. "Where is Edward Mercer?" Mara said. Deacon wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Goss has a property. Old motel off Route 11, past the county line. Boarded up. He uses the basement as a holding point for people who've seen things. Keeps them there until they agree to disappear permanently or until they're no longer a problem." He paused. "Edward's been there for 3 weeks. I've seen him. He's alive. But Mara? Goss knows about the list. He knows someone found it, and he's moving the operation tomorrow night." "Moving it where?" "I don't know. But when he moves, he cleans house. Everything. Everyone." Deacon looked at Leia, and his eyes held something worse than guilt. They held the weight of knowing that his silence, his compliance, his desperate deal with a man who traded in lies, had kept a 20-year-old woman's brother locked in a basement for 22 days. "If we don't get Edward out by tomorrow night," Deacon said, "there won't be anyone left to get out." The rain screamed against the roof. The neon signs flickered once, twice, then held steady, blue and red light bleeding across the faces of every person in the room. Mara turned to Cade. Cade looked back at her. And in that silence, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, a decision was made that none of them could come back from. "Get the bikes ready," Mara said. "All of them. We ride at dawn." Nobody argued. Nobody hesitated. One by one, they stood and moved toward the door. Wrench, Jules, Bowie, the remaining members who hadn't fled, filing out into the rain with the grim, automatic efficiency of people who had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. People who understood that some roads only go in one direction. Leia stood at the window and watched them disappear into the garage, their silhouettes swallowed by the dark, and she felt the ground beneath her shift. Not literally, but in the way that ground shifts when you realize you've crossed a line you didn't see, and the person you were on the other side of it no longer exists. Behind her, Deacon sat alone at the table, his head in his hands, his coffee untouched, his cut still bleeding slowly down his temple. And somewhere out there, past the rain, past the dead highways, past the boarded-up motel on Route 11. Edward was counting the hours he had left, not knowing if anyone was coming, not knowing if the sister he'd tried to protect was about to ride straight into the same darkness that had swallowed him whole. Dawn never came. Not really. The sky went from black to a deep, infected gray, and the rain kept falling like the atmosphere had given up trying to do anything else. 4:30 in the morning, and the compound was already alive. Not with noise, but with the controlled, deliberate movement of people preparing for something they might not come back from. Laya hadn't slept. She'd sat on the couch in the back room with her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the rain and the low murmur of voices through the walls, watching the hours crawl past on her cracked phone screen. At some point, she'd pulled up Edward's contact photo again and stared at it until his face stopped looking like a person and started looking like a question she might never get to answer. Now she stood in the garage doorway watching Cade check his bike for the third time. His hands moved over the machine with the mechanical precision of a man who had learned long ago that preparation was the only thing standing between you and a body bag. He checked the chain tension, he checked the tire pressure, he checked the saddlebags, which now held things Leia didn't want to think about. Heavy things, angular things, things that clinked against each other when the bag shifted. "You don't have to come," Cade said without looking up. "Yes, I do." "No, you want to. That's different." "He's my brother." Cade straightened. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her, and in the gray light his face was all plains and shadows, like something carved from the same stone as the mountains north of town. "If something goes wrong out there, wanting it won't keep you alive. Training will. Experience will. And you don't have either." He wasn't cruel about it. He said it the way a doctor says the test results are bad, factual, necessary, devoid of comfort, because comfort would be a lie. "I'm going," Leia said. Cade held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he reached into the saddlebag and pulled out a leather jacket. Black, scarred, too big for her, smelling of road dust and old sweat. He held it out. "Wear this. It's lined. If the bike goes down, it's the difference between road rash and losing skin." She put it on. The sleeves hung past her wrists. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like armor, like a promise, like the physical manifestation of a world she was choosing to enter, knowing full well it might swallow her whole. In the main room, Mara was standing over the long table with a county road map spread under the bare bulbs. Red circles marked 3 routes to the motel on Route 11. Blue X's marked known points of exposure, intersections with traffic cameras, gas stations with security feeds, stretches of road visible from occupied houses. Deacon sat at the far end of the table, drawing the motel's layout from memory on the back of a napkin. His hand was steady now. Whatever storm had been tearing through him the night before had settled into something flat and functional, the numb efficiency of a man who had accepted that the only way forward was through. 2 entrances, Deacon said, his pen moving in short, precise strokes. Front door, boarded up, but the boards are loose. They use it for foot access. Back door leads to a kitchen that connects to a hallway. Basement access is through a door at the end of that hallway, padlocked from outside. He tapped the napkin. Goss keeps 2 men on rotation, sometimes 3. They carry pistols, maybe a shotgun. They're not military. They're muscle to local guys, the kind who take cash and don't ask questions. And Goss himself? Mara asked. He won't be there. Goss doesn't get his hands dirty. He operates from a distance. Phone calls, intermediaries, layers between him and anything that can be tied back. Deacon paused. But he has a man. Name's Tull. Big guy. Ex-corrections. Face like a cinder block. Tull's the one who runs the site. If he's there, things get complicated. Define complicated, Cade said from the doorway. Tull doesn't negotiate. He doesn't threaten. He acts. Fast. I've seen him put a man on the ground before the man finished his sentence. Deacon set the pen down. If Tull's at that motel, we need to be in and out in under 5 minutes, or we're not getting out at all. Mara studied the napkin map for a long time. The fluorescent light above the table hummed and flickered, casting her shadow in stuttering fragments across the wall. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat, deliberate weight of someone issuing orders they know might get people killed. Wrench, you take Bowie and Jules. South approach. You hit the back door and clear the kitchen. Cade, you're with me through the front. Deacon. She looked at him. The pause lasted long enough for the room to feel it. You stay with the bikes. You're our exit. Mara, you lost the right to argue when you put on their patch and loaded their trucks. Mara's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You want to help? Keep those engines warm and the road clear. That's your redemption tonight. Take it or leave. Deacon's jaw tightened. He nodded once. Leia rides with Cade, Mara continued. When we get Edward out, she takes him to Cade's bike and they go. Straight back to the compound. No stops, no detours. What about the rest of you? Leia asked. Mara looked at her. We'll be right behind you. It was a lie. Leia knew it was a lie. Mara knew she knew. But some lies exist not to deceive but to make the next 10 minutes survivable, and this was one of them. They rode out at 5:15. 6 bikes in tight formation, headlights cutting through the rain like surgical instruments, the roar of the engine swallowed by the storm. The highway was empty, nothing but wet asphalt and darkness, and the occasional flash of a passing road sign reflected in the rain. Leia pressed herself against Cade's back and felt the vibration of the Harley move through her body like a second pulse. Her hands gripped his jacket so tight her fingers ached. The ride took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of freezing rain and wind that cut through the leather jacket like it wasn't there. 40 minutes of watching the road ahead disappear into nothing and reappear in fragments, a guardrail, a dead tree, the hollow eyes of a deer frozen in the headlights before bolting into the dark. They turned off Route 11 onto a gravel road that hadn't been maintained in years. Potholes filled with brown water. Branches scraped against their arms as the tree line closed in. The road narrowed and curved and then opened into a clearing, and there it was, the motel. It was worse than Leia had imagined. A long single-story building with maybe 12 rooms, all of them boarded up, the roof sagging in the middle like a spine that had given up. The sign out front was missing most of its letters, just a skeletal metal frame with a few plastic panels hanging at wrong angles. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, sections of it collapsed, others patched with plywood. 2 trucks were parked behind the building, dark, mud-caked, no plates visible, no lights, no movement. Just the rain and the building sitting there in the dark like something dead that hadn't finished falling down. Mara killed her engine first. The others followed. The silence that replaced the Harleys was immediate and total, not peaceful, but suffocating, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you hear things that aren't there. They dismounted in the tree line, 50 yards from the fence. Deacon stayed with the bikes, his face blank, his hands on the handlebars of Mara's Heritage Softail. He didn't look at any of them as they moved out. He stared straight ahead into the rain like a man watching his own future drown. Wrench moved first, cutting left through the trees with Bowie and Jules, heading for the back approach. Leia watched them disappear into the dark. 3 shapes, there and then gone, swallowed by the storm. Mara checked her watch. 3 minutes, then we go. Cade stood beside Leia. He hadn't spoken since they left the compound. The shotgun was slung across his back and his eyes moved continuously across the property. The trucks, the windows, the fence line, the roof line. Cataloging threats with the automatic discipline of a man who had spent years clearing buildings in places that wanted him dead. Stay behind me, he said. If I stop, you stop. If I move, you move. If I tell you to run, you don't look back. I'm not leaving without Edward. If I tell you to run, Cade said again, slower, harder, each word a nail driven into wood, you don't look back. The 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. Then Mara nodded, and they moved. They crossed the clearing at a low run, the wet grass soaking through Leia's boots in seconds. Cade cut a hole in the chain-link fence with a tool she didn't see, peeling back the metal like skin from a wound. They slipped through. The front of the motel loomed above them, boards across every window, the door sealed with plywood that had been pulled loose on one side and left hanging. Mara pried the plywood back. The hinges of the door behind it were rusted but functional. She pushed it open with her shoulder, and the smell hit Leia like a wall. Mold, urine, something chemical she couldn't identify, and beneath it all the stale, trapped smell of a space that hadn't been opened to fresh air in months. Inside, the motel lobby was a ruin. The front desk was overturned. Ceiling tiles hung in shreds. Water pooled on the floor from a dozen different leaks. But someone had been here recently. Boot prints in the dust, cigarette butts on the floor, a folding chair positioned near the hallway entrance where a guard would sit. The chair was empty. Mara raised her hand. Stop. They listened. Rain on the roof. The drip of water somewhere deep in the building. A low hum. Electrical, maybe a generator, coming from below. Below. The basement. Mara moved down the hallway. Cade followed, shotgun up. Leia pressed herself against the wall and moved with them, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The hallway was dark. No windows. Mara used a small flashlight, the beam tight, controlled, moving across the floor and walls in quick sweeps. Doors on both sides, all closed, some padlocked. What was behind them Leia didn't want to know. At the end of the hallway, a metal door. A padlock on the outside, just like Deacon described. But the padlock was open, hanging from the hasp, unlocked. Mara stopped. She looked at the padlock, then at Cade. Something was wrong. Cade felt it too. Leia could see it in the way his body changed, a subtle shift from aggressive to defensive, from hunting to being hunted. His eyes swept the hallway behind them. Empty. But the emptiness didn't feel right. It felt staged, curated, like a room that had been cleaned before an inspection. Mara pulled the padlock free and opened the door. Concrete stairs descended into a blue-white glow. The generator-powered fluorescent lights Deacon had mentioned. The air coming up from below was cold and damp, and carried the smell of concrete dust and sweat, and something Leia recognized from deep in her memory, from childhood, from a time before the Mercer house, the sharp animal smell of fear. They went down. The basement was a single room, maybe 30 feet by 20. Concrete floor. Concrete walls. 2 fluorescent tubes on the ceiling, one working, one flickering in a rhythm that felt like a headache made visible. A folding table with water bottles and food wrappers. A portable heater in the corner, unplugged. 2 cots against the far wall, both with rumpled blankets. And sitting on one of those cots, his back to the wall, his knees drawn up to his chest, his face turned toward the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Edward. Leia made a sound. Not a word. Not a scream. Something primal, something that came from a place below language. The sound of recognition so intense it bypassed every civilized mechanism the human body has for processing emotion and went straight to the throat. Edward. He looked at her. He was thinner than the Polaroid had shown. His cheekbones were sharp, his eyes sunken, his hair longer and unwashed. He wore the same clothes he'd been wearing when he disappeared. Flannel shirt, work jeans, boots. But they hung on him now like they belonged to someone larger, someone who had existed before this room erased him. Leia? His voice was a husk. Dry, cracked. The voice of a man who hadn't spoken in days because there was no one to speak to. She crossed the room in 4 steps and dropped to her knees beside the cot. She put her hands on his face. He was real. He was warm. He was alive. "I found you," she whispered. "I found you." Edward's hand came up and gripped her wrist. Not gently, hard, desperate. The grip of someone who had been drowning for 3 weeks and had just felt a hand break the surface. "You have to go," he said. "Leia, you have to go right now." "We're getting you out." "No, listen to me." His eyes were wild, darting between Leia and Mara and Cade and the staircase. "This is wrong. They left this morning. All of them. Tull, the guards, everyone. Just packed up and drove away. They didn't say anything to me. They just left the door unlocked and went." Mara went still. "When?" Cade said. "Hours ago. Maybe 3, maybe 4. Edward's voice was rising, the panic surfacing through the exhaustion. "They've never done that before. Someone's been here every second since they brought me. And then today? Nothing. They just left. Why would they just leave?" The flickering fluorescent buzzed overhead. Water dripped somewhere in the walls. And in the silence that followed Edward's question, Leia watched Mara's face transform, the calm command draining away, replaced by something she had never seen on the older woman's face. Fear. "It's a setup," Mara said. Cade was already moving toward the stairs. "We need to go. Now." "They knew we were coming," Mara said. Her voice was tight, controlled, but the edges were fraying. "Deacon told us the layout. Deacon told us the schedule. Deacon told us they'd be here." The words hit the room like a detonation. Leia looked at Mara. "You think Deacon? I think Deacon told Goss we were coming before he ever walked into our compound last night." Edward was on his feet now, swaying, one hand on the wall for balance. "The man who talked to me. Tull. He said something before he left this morning. He said I should thank whoever sent me a rescue party. He said it was going to make things a whole lot simpler. Cade was at the top of the stairs. He stopped, listened. Then he came back down, 3 steps at a time. Trucks, he said. 2 of them. Coming up the gravel road. The fluorescent light buzzed. The heater sat dead in the corner. And the 6 people in that basement, Mara, Cade, Leia, Edward, and somewhere above them Wrench's team, stood in the cold blue light and understood with perfect, annihilating clarity that they had walked into a trap. Mara pulled a phone from her jacket and hit a number. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. No answer. She tried another number. Same result. She looked at the screen and her expression went flat. No signal down here. She shoved the phone back. Wrench doesn't know. Wrench is in the kitchen, Cade said. He'll hear the trucks. Wrench is expecting 2 guards and maybe Tull, not a convoy. The sound of tires on gravel reached them through the concrete, muffled but unmistakable, growing louder, the crunch of multiple vehicles approaching with the unhurried confidence of people who knew exactly what they were driving into. Mara moved to the stairs. Cade, take Edward and Leia through the back. Find Wrench. Get to the bikes. What about you? I'm going to buy you time. Mara. That wasn't a suggestion. She looked back at him, and something passed between them that Leia couldn't fully read. Not a goodbye, but an acknowledgement. The silent recognition between 2 people who have been through enough to know that some moments don't allow for sentiment. Cade grabbed Edward's arm and pulled him toward the stairs. Edward stumbled. 3 weeks in a basement had taken his legs, and Leia ducked under his other arm, taking his weight against her shoulder. He was lighter than she remembered, lighter than a man his height should be. She could feel his ribs through the flannel shirt. They moved up the stairs and into the hallway. Behind them, Mara climbed the steps and turned toward the front of the building, the flashlight off now, moving in darkness with the confidence of someone who had long ago made peace with the possibility that any room she entered might be the last one. The hallway was still dark, still empty. Cade moved fast, one hand on Edward, the other on the shotgun, his boots barely making sound on the wet floor. They reached the back of the building and found the kitchen, a gutted room with a dead stove, a collapsed shelf, and a back door that stood open to the rain. Wrench was there, Jules, Bowie, all 3 standing in the kitchen with their faces turned toward the sound of trucks, their bodies rigid with the specific tension of people who have just realized the plan is no longer the plan. How many? Wrench said. At least 2 vehicles, Cade said. Could be more. Deacon played us. Wrench's face didn't change, but his hand went to his belt and came back holding a crowbar, and the way he held it, low, loose, the grip of someone who had used one before and not for pulling nails, told Leia everything she needed to know about what was coming. Mara's at the front, Cade said. She's buying time. Buying time with what? Jules said. Nobody answered. From the front of the building came the sound of truck doors opening, multiple doors, multiple boots on gravel. Voices, low, professional, the clipped communication of people executing a plan. And then Mara's voice, cutting through the rain like a razor. You're on private property. A pause. Then a man's voice, deep, unhurried, amused in a way that made Leia's skin crawl. Private property. That's cute. You know whose property this is, sweetheart? Don't call me sweetheart. You've got about 30 seconds to tell me how many of your people are inside that building before this gets real ugly, real fast. Mara's response was silence. And in that silence, Cade made a decision. He handed the shotgun to Wrench, pulled Edward fully onto Leia's shoulder, and moved toward the door. Take them to the bikes, Cade told Wrench. The tree line. Go. Where are you going? To get Mara. Cade. Go. He was out the back door and into the rain before Wrench could respond. Leia watched him disappear around the corner of the building, a shadow moving against shadows, silent, purposeful, returning to the one thing in his life he had decided was worth dying for. Wrench didn't hesitate. He grabbed Edward's other arm and they moved, out the back door, across the muddy ground behind the motel, toward the tree line. Jules took point, moving fast and low. Bowie covered the rear, his tire iron in one hand and the shotgun Cade had left in the other. Leia ran. Edward ran beside her, or tried to. His legs buckled every few steps and she pulled him upright by sheer force of will, her boots slipping in the mud, rain hammering her face, the borrowed leather jacket heavy and soaked and dragging at her shoulders. Behind them, from the front of the motel, voices escalated. Then a sharp sound. Not a gunshot, but something heavy striking something solid. A grunt. A shout. More voices overlapping. Leia didn't look back. She ran. They reached the tree line. The bikes were there. 6 machines parked in a row, engines cold, rain beating on the chrome and leather. And standing beside them, his hands on the handlebars of Mara's Heritage Softail, was Deacon. He saw them coming. His face cycled through something complicated and fast. Surprise, relief, guilt, calculation, and settled on a blank mask that fooled nobody. Wrench dropped Edward's arm and crossed the distance to Deacon in 3 strides. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He swung the crowbar in a flat arc that caught Deacon across the shoulder and dropped him to his knees in the mud. "You sold us out," Wrench said. His voice was low and shaking, not with anger but with the specific devastation of discovering that someone you rode with, someone you bled with, someone who held your jacket at your mother's funeral, had been the knife in your back the entire time. Deacon stayed on his knees. He didn't fight. He didn't deny it. He looked up at Wrench with rain running down his face and blood starting to seep through his jacket where the crowbar had hit, and he said, "They have my daughter." The words landed in the rain like stones dropped into deep water. Wrench froze. The crowbar stopped mid-swing on its second arc. Jules took a step back. Even Bowie, who had been circling behind Deacon with the shotgun, went still. "What?" Wrench said. "Goss took her 6 months ago. Kayla, she's 11. Deacon's voice broke completely. Not the controlled crack from the night before at the clubhouse, but a total collapse. The sound of a man whose last wall had finally come down. "She was staying with her mother in Dalton. Goss's people picked her up on her way to school. They sent me a photo, just one. Her sitting in a room, concrete walls, a cot." He was sobbing now, the words coming between gasps. "They said if I cooperated, she'd be fine. They said if I talked, they'd send her back in pieces. What was I supposed to do? What was I supposed to do?" Leia felt the ground shift beneath her for the second time in 12 hours. Everything she thought she understood about Deacon, the betrayal, the corruption, the cold calculation of a man who had chosen the wrong side, dissolved and reformed into something far worse. Not a villain, a father. A man who had been given an impossible choice and had chosen the only option that kept his child alive, even if it destroyed everything else. Wrench lowered the crowbar. His hand was shaking. "Where is she now?" Jules said. "I don't know. They move her. Different locations. I get a photo once a week to prove she's alive." Deacon reached into his vest with his good hand and pulled out a creased, water-stained Polaroid. He held it up. A girl. Dark hair. Sitting on a cot in a concrete room. Not crying, not smiling. Just sitting there with the flat, hollowed-out expression of a child who has stopped expecting rescue. The photo shook in his hand. "I didn't sell you out," Deacon said. "I warned them you were coming because they told me to, but I also told you the truth. Edward was here. I told you the real layout. I gave you enough to get him out before the trucks arrived." He wiped his face. "It wasn't enough. I know, but it's all I had." From the motel the sounds had changed. The shouting had stopped. Engines were revving. Headlights swept across the tree line, and Leia ducked instinctively, pulling Edward down with her behind Cade's bike. "We need to leave," Bowie said. "Right now." "What about Mara and Cade?" Leia said. Bowie looked toward the motel. The headlights were moving, circling the building, probing the darkness. A door slammed. Someone barked an order. "They know what they're doing," Bowie said. But he said it the way people say things that are true only if the universe is kind. And tonight the universe was anything but. Jules was already on her bike. "Wrench, get Deacon on the back. Bowie, you take Edward. Leia?" She tossed a set of keys. "Cade's Road King. You said you can drive. Prove it." Leia caught the keys. She looked at the matte black Harley. 800 pounds of machine, no chrome, no mercy, built for a man twice her size, and felt something inside her rearrange. Not courage. Something older than courage. The animal recognition that the moment had arrived where who she had been no longer mattered, and who she was about to become was the only thing that could save the people she loved. She swung her leg over the seat. The bike was enormous beneath her. The handlebars were set wide and low, the foot pegs too far forward. She turned the key, and the engine caught with a deep, seismic growl that vibrated through her entire body, through the borrowed jacket, through the bones beneath her skin. She had never ridden a motorcycle in her life. She kicked it into gear and twisted the throttle, and the Harley lurched forward through the mud and rain, the back tire spinning, catching, grabbing. And then she was moving, following Jules's taillights through the trees, the wind and rain hammering her visor, Edward behind her on Bowie's bike, Deacon bleeding on the back of wrenches, and behind all of them, growing smaller in the dark, the motel where Mara Vale and Cade Rayner were still standing between a convoy of men and the only road out. The bikes hit the highway, and the engine screamed. Leia leaned into the wind, her hands white on the grips, her teeth clenched, the Road King responding to every input with brutal, immediate obedience. A machine built for someone who knew what they were doing, being ridden by someone who was learning in real time at 70 miles an hour on a rain-soaked highway in the dark. Behind her, through the rain, she heard something that made her blood stop. A single gunshot, flat, final, echoing across the empty fields. Then another. Then silence. Leia didn't look back. She couldn't. The bike demanded everything, every ounce of focus, every scrap of muscle, every fragment of her attention. And the highway stretched ahead into the black, and the rain kept falling, and somewhere behind her, in a motel parking lot at the edge of nowhere, two people she barely knew but already couldn't imagine losing were fighting for the time she was using to run. She twisted the throttle harder. The needle climbed. 80, 85. The Harley ate the road like it was built for this exact moment, this exact night, this exact storm, this exact girl with no training and no plan and nothing left to lose except the brother pressed against a stranger's back on the bike behind her and the borrowed jacket of a man who might already be dead. The compound appeared through the rain like a ghost. The metal fences, the dark buildings, the barrel fire long since drowned. Jules hit the gate first and it swung open. They poured in, 5 bikes, 5 bodies, plus Edward and Deacon, all of them soaked and shaking and running on the last fumes of adrenaline. Leia killed the engine and sat on the bike, unable to move. Her hands wouldn't unclench from the grips. Her legs were shaking so badly she couldn't trust them to hold her weight. Rain ran down her face and she couldn't tell if she was crying or if it was just the storm. Jules appeared beside her. Inside, now! Leia got off the bike. She walked 3 steps and her knees buckled. Jules caught her, one arm around her waist, and half carried her through the clubhouse door. Edward was already inside, slumped on the couch in the back room, a blanket around his shoulders, a bottle of water in his hands. He was trembling. Not from cold, from the specific bone-deep tremor of a body that has been held in a state of terror for so long that safety doesn't register as relief. It registers as shock. Leia knelt beside him. She didn't speak. She just put her forehead against his shoulder and breathed. And he put his hand on the back of her head, and they stayed like that while the rain hammered the roof and the neon signs buzzed and the clubhouse filled with the sounds of people trying to figure out what comes after the worst night of their lives. 20 minutes passed. 30. Wrench paced the main room like a caged animal. Jules sat at the bar cleaning a cut on her forearm with peroxide and a rag. Bowie stood at the window, watching the gate, his shotgun across his knees. Deacon sat alone at the end of the table, his shoulder wrapped in a makeshift bandage, his daughter's Polaroid face down on the wood in front of him. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody looked at him. He existed in a zone of quarantine, not forgiven, not condemned, just held in the terrible limbo of a man whose worst sin had been loving someone enough to betray everyone else. At the 40-minute mark, Jules said what everyone was thinking. They should be back by now. Wrench stopped pacing. He looked at the door, then at Jules, then at the door again. Give them another 20, he said. 20 minutes could be the difference between... I know what it could be the difference between. Wrench's voice was raw. Give them 20. 18 minutes later they heard it. The low, distant rumble of motorcycle engines. 2 of them. Coming from the east, from the direction of Route 11. Bowie was at the gate before the bikes reached the compound. He pulled it open and the 2 Harleys rolled in. Mara's Heritage Softail and a bike Leia didn't recognize, older, stripped, with no plates and no lights. Mara dismounted first. She moved slowly, one hand pressed against her left side, her jacket dark and wet in a way that wasn't entirely rain. Cade came off the second bike and caught her elbow as she swayed. I'm fine, Mara said. You're bleeding, Cade said. I said I'm fine. She walked into the clubhouse under her own power, leaving a trail of red drops on the concrete floor that mixed with the rainwater and turned pink at the edges. She made it to the table. She pulled out a chair. She sat down and placed both hands flat on the wood, and for the first time Leia saw the full extent of the damage. A gash along Mara's left side, below the ribs, long but not deep, bleeding steadily through the torn fabric of her shirt. Jules was there in seconds with a first aid kit. Mara let her work without protest, which told Leia more about the severity than any words could have. Report, Mara said. Her voice was thin but steady. Edward's safe, Wrench said. Deacon's contained. Everyone's accounted for. Mara looked across the room at Deacon. He met her eyes. The Polaroid of his daughter sat between them on the table, and the distance between those two people, measured in feet but spanning years of trust, betrayal, grief, and the impossible weight of competing loves, felt like the widest gap in the world. His daughter, Mara said. Not a question. Kayla, Deacon said. She's 11. Mara closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had changed. Not forgiveness. That was too clean a word for what moved across her face. Something harder. Something that looked like a decision forged in pain and tempered in the understanding that the world had never been simple and was never going to be. We find her, Mara said. Wrench looked at her. Mara, we find the girl. Then we burn Goss's operation to the ground. Every truck, every warehouse, every name in every ledger. She placed her hand on the table and pushed herself to standing, Jules's bandage already spotting red beneath her jacket. They came at us tonight thinking we'd break. They came at us thinking we'd scatter like every other name on that list. She looked around the room, at Wrench with his crowbar, at Jules with her peroxide-stained hands, at Bowie with his shotgun, at Deacon with his daughter's photograph, at Cade with his granite face and his military silence, at Edward wrapped in a blanket on the couch, at Leia standing in a borrowed leather jacket 2 sizes too big with mud on her boots and blood on her hands that wasn't hers. They were wrong, Mara said. And in that moment, standing wounded in a clubhouse at the edge of a dying town, while the rain pounded the roof and the neon signs bled color into the dark, Mara Vale stopped being a club president giving orders and became something else entirely. Something that had no title and no rank and no name, because the thing she had become was simply a woman who had lost enough to know that the only thing worse than fighting was standing still, while the people around her disappeared one by one into the silence. Leia looked at Cade. I was watching Mara, and on his face, that sealed, impenetrable face that gave away nothing, she saw the faintest trace of something she could only describe as recognition. The look of a soldier who has just heard the order he's been waiting for his entire life. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, engines cooled and blood dried, and the first fragile architecture of a plan began to form in the space between exhaustion and fury. And somewhere out there, in a concrete room with no windows, an 11-year-old girl sat on a cot and waited for someone to come, not knowing that the people who would risk everything to find her were the same people the world had already written off as lost. 3 days. That's how long they had before Goss moved his entire operation out of the county and vanished like smoke through a cracked window. 3 days to find an 11-year-old girl hidden somewhere in a network of abandoned properties, safe houses, and corrupted officials stretching across 4 counties. 3 days to dismantle something that had been growing in the dark for over a decade. Mara didn't sleep. She sat at the long table in the clubhouse with Gerald's shoebox of photographs spread in front of her, cross-referencing names from the list with addresses Deacon had written from memory, connecting dots on the county road map with red pen until the paper looked like a web drawn by something sick and patient. The bandage on her side seeped through twice. Jules changed it twice. Mara didn't stop working either time. Cade sat across from her, cleaning the shotgun with methodical focus, the metal parts laid out on a cloth like surgical instruments. He didn't contribute to the planning. He didn't need to. His role was simpler and older than strategy. When the time came, he would stand between the people he cared about and whatever was trying to destroy them, and the planning was just the distance between now and then. Edward slept on the backroom couch for 14 hours straight. When he finally emerged, blinking against the harsh overhead lights, he looked less like a ghost and more like a man slowly remembering what it felt like to have a body that belonged to him. Leia brought him coffee and toast from the small kitchen behind the bar. He ate without tasting it, his eyes moving constantly around the room, cataloging exits and faces with the reflexive paranoia of someone who had spent 3 weeks in a basement expecting every footstep to be his last. "I need to tell you something," Edward said to Leia on the second morning, sitting on the back steps of the compound while freezing rain misted the air around them. His voice was steadier now, but still thin, like wires stretched too tight. "Tell me." "The warehouse. The night I saw them unloading trucks." He stared at his hands. "I wasn't there by accident. I went back after my shift because I'd left my jacket inside. But when I got there, the loading bay was open and the lights were on, and there were men I'd never seen before moving crates from a truck with no plates into the back storage area." He paused. "I should have left, I know that. But I didn't. I stood there and watched because something about the way they moved, fast, quiet, no talking, made me feel like I was seeing something that mattered. Something that explained why the foreman always told us to leave by 6 and never come back after dark." "What was in the crates?" Edward shook his head. "I don't know. They were sealed, heavy. Took 2 men to lift each one. But here's the thing, Leia. One of the men saw me. He looked right at me. And he didn't yell. He didn't chase me. He just looked at me and then looked at somebody behind me, and when I turned around, there was nobody there. But the next morning, when I came in for my shift, the foreman told me I was terminated. No reason, just done." He rubbed his face. 2 days later, a man showed up at my apartment. Didn't knock. Just walked in. Sat down at my kitchen table like he owned the place. Big guy. Face like concrete. Tull. Yeah, Tull. He didn't threaten me. That was the worst part. He just sat there and told me very calmly what would happen if I talked to anyone about what I'd seen. He described my apartment, described my truck, described the route I take to the diner. Edward's voice cracked. "He described you, Leia, where you work, where you park your car, what time you leave the library on Tuesdays." The rain misted between them. Leia felt something cold settle into her chest. Not fear exactly, but the understanding that the danger had never been abstract. It had been specific, detailed, personal. These people had mapped her life before she even knew they existed. "That's why you ran," she said. "I didn't run for me. I ran because as long as I was near you, you were a target. If I disappeared, if I stopped existing, they had no reason to touch you." His eyes were red. "I thought if I just stayed gone long enough, they'd forget. Move on, find someone else to worry about." He laughed, a short, broken sound. "I was wrong. They don't forget. They collect." Inside the clubhouse, the plan was taking shape. Deacon, seated at his end of the table with his injured shoulder and the permanent quarantine of distrust surrounding him, had produced something unexpected, a burner phone with a single number saved in it. The number Goss's people used to send him weekly proof-of-life photos of Kayla. "They send the photo every Wednesday," Deacon said, "always between 8 and 9 in the evening. The photos have GPS data in them. They don't scrub the metadata. Either they're sloppy or they don't think I'm smart enough to check." "You checked?" Wrench said, surprise breaking through his anger for the first time. "I'm not stupid, Wrench. I'm desperate. There's a difference." Deacon slid the phone across the table. The last 3 photos were taken at different locations, but the one from last Wednesday, the GPS coordinates match a property on Miller Creek Road, old grain storage facility. 2 buildings, 1 main road in, creek on the east side. Mara studied the phone screen. "You're sure?" "I'm sure that's where she was 6 days ago. I can't promise she's still there." 6 days is a long time. 6 days is all I've got. Mara looked at Cade. The silent communication between them had evolved over the past 48 hours into something Leia could almost read. Not the words, but the weight. Cade tilted his head a fraction to the left. Mara's jaw tightened. An agreement reached in the space between heartbeats. "We go tonight," Mara said. "Tonight's too soon," Wrench said. "We don't have enough people. Stokes left. 2 others left. We're down to—" "I know how many we are." Mara's voice cut clean. "We go tonight because tomorrow Goss starts moving and the day after that Kayla becomes a ghost. Every hour we wait is an hour they have to relocate her. And if it's another trap? Then we spring it with our eyes open this time." The afternoon bled into evening. Rain turned to sleet. The temperature dropped below freezing, and the compound's pipes groaned in the walls like wounded animals. Leia helped Jules load the saddlebags, first aid supplies, flashlights, bolt cutters, rope, tools for extraction, tools for the kind of work that exists in the gray space between rescue and war. At 6 o'clock, a truck pulled up to the compound gate. Not one of Goss's. This was a battered Ford pickup with a cracked tailgate and a support your local mechanic bumper sticker. The driver killed the engine and stepped out into the sleet. Gerald Briggs, 70 years old, white-haired, wearing his flannel shirt buttoned to the neck and carrying a 12-gauge shotgun that looked older than he was. "Don't," Mara said from the doorway. "I heard what happened at the motel," Gerald said. "Everyone's heard. You think news doesn't travel in a town this small?" He walked through the gate without waiting for an invitation. "I've been sitting on evidence for 8 months because I was scared. I'm still scared. But I watched Danny Reeves get run out of his home. I watched Connie Faust turn into a prisoner in her own house. I watched your girl," he nodded toward Leia, "walk into a biker clubhouse alone because nobody else in this entire county had the guts to help her. And I decided that being scared and being useless are two different things, and I'm done being both." Behind him, another vehicle pulled up, then another, then a motorcycle. Not a Harley, a smaller bike, ridden by a woman Leia recognized from the diner on Route 29. Then a minivan driven by a man she didn't recognize, who stepped out carrying a folder thick with papers. Within an hour, 11 people stood in the compound who had never been inside the Black Veil Riders' gates before. Ordinary people. A waitress. A retired postal worker. A woman who ran the laundromat on 5th Street. A man who used to be a county building inspector before he was fired for asking questions about the Colton Road warehouse permits. Each of them carrying something. Photographs, receipts, handwritten accounts, tax records, inspection reports stamped with dates and signatures that didn't match. They stood in the clubhouse under the neon signs, surrounded by leather jackets and motorcycle parts and the permanent smell of engine oil, and they looked terrified, every single one of them. But they were there. Mara stood at the head of the table and looked at them, and Leia saw something shift in the older woman's face. Not surprise, not gratitude, but recognition. The understanding that the isolation she'd been fighting against, the silence that had protected Goss's operation for years, was finally breaking apart. Not because of force, because of exhaustion, because the fear of staying silent had finally outweighed the fear of speaking. "Everything you brought," Mara said, "put it on the table." They did. The evidence piled up. A mountain of paper and photographs and handwritten notes. Years of quiet observation compiled by people who had been watching and waiting and collecting because they knew, even when they couldn't prove it, that something was wrong. The retired postal worker, a quiet man named Vernon, had the most damning piece, a logbook he'd kept for 3 years, documenting irregular shipments to the Colton Road warehouse. Dates, times, truck descriptions, license plates he'd copied down during his mail route. "I reported it twice," Vernon said, but both times the report disappeared. Third time, my supervisor told me to stop asking about things that weren't my business. He set the logbook on the table. So I kept my own records, just in case someone ever came asking. Mara picked up the logbook and paged through it. Her expression didn't change, but her hand tightened on the spine. "This is enough," she said quietly. "This is more than enough." But evidence alone wouldn't get Kayla back. And evidence alone wouldn't stop a man who had spent a decade building an operation protected by people whose badges and titles made them untouchable. For that, they needed something else. At 8 o'clock, Mara made a phone call. She stepped outside into the sleet, away from the others, and stood beside the barrel fire with the phone pressed to her ear. Leia watched from the window. Mara talked for less than 2 minutes. She hung up. She stood in the sleet for another minute, not moving, her breath rising in white clouds, and then she came back inside. "Vivian Cross," Mara said, investigative reporter. Regional paper, but she's got contacts at 3 state outlets and a cable news desk. I've known her for 5 years. She's been trying to break a story on county-level corruption in this area, but could never get enough sources to go on record. Mara looked at the room. "She's driving here tonight. She'll be here by midnight, and she's bringing a camera crew." The room stirred. Gerald shifted on his feet. Vernon clutched his logbook. The laundromat woman wrapped her arms around herself. "Anyone who talks to her is on the record," Mara said. "That means your name, your face, on camera, published, no going back." She paused. I'm not going to ask any of you to do that. This isn't my decision to make, but I need you to understand that without faces and names, this is just paper, and paper burns. The silence lasted 10 seconds, 20. Long enough for the fear to circulate through the room like a current, touching every person, testing every resolve. Gerald spoke first. I'm in. Vernon second. So am I. One by one, they committed. Not with speeches, not with bravado, with nods and tight jaws and hands that shook when they reached for their coffee mugs. The waitress from the diner, the building inspector, the laundromat woman. Ordinary people making extraordinary decisions in a clubhouse that smelled like motor oil and burnt coffee, surrounded by bikers they'd been afraid of 2 days ago. The plan crystallized into 2 parallel operations. Team 1, Mara, Cade, Wrench, Jules, and Bowie, would move on the Miller Creek Road property at midnight to extract Kayla. Team 2, the witnesses, protected by Gerald and 2 club members who would stay behind, would wait for Vivian Cross and begin recording testimony. Leia would ride with Team 1. No, Edward said when she told him. It's not your call. Leia, you almost died 2 nights ago. You rode a motorcycle you'd never been on through a rainstorm at 80 miles an hour. You got lucky. Luck doesn't hold. Neither does patience. She looked at him. 3 weeks, Edward. You were in that basement for 3 weeks. I'm not sitting in another room waiting to find out if the people who went to get someone are coming back. I can't do it again. I won't. Edward stared at her. She stared back. And in the space between them, something old and wordless passed. The understanding that exists between 2 people who had grown up sharing the same fears, the same nightmares, the same instinct to protect each other at any cost, and the realization that the cost had finally arrived. Then I'm going too, Edward said. You can barely stand. I've been standing for 3 weeks on nothing. I can stand for 1 more night on something. Mara settled it. Edward stayed. I was too weak, too visible, too valuable as a witness. He would stay with the second team and tell his story to Vivian Cross. His voice. His face. On the record. Edward didn't argue. He sat down on the couch and put his face in his hands, and Leia knelt in front of him and placed her palms on his knees. When I come back, she said, we're going home. He looked up. His eyes were wet but steady. You promise? Yeah, I promise. It was this kind of promise that has no business being made in a situation where nothing is guaranteed. But they made it anyway, because some promises exist not to predict the future, but to give the present enough weight to survive. At 11:30, Team 1 mounted up. 5 bikes. 5 riders. Leia on the back of Cade's Road King, her arms locked around his midsection, the borrowed leather jacket zipped to her chin. The sleet had turned to freezing rain again, and the compound glowed under the security lights like a stage set for the last act of something terrible and necessary. Mara pulled up beside Cade. Her face was pale beneath the helmet. The wound at her side was freshly bandaged, but Leia could see the stiffness in the way she gripped the handlebars, the slight hitch in her breathing when the bike vibrated beneath her. You good? Cade said. Don't ask me that. Mara kicked her bike into gear. Let's go. They rode east through the freezing dark. Miller Creek Road was 45 minutes out, past the county line, into territory that didn't belong to anyone Mara knew or trusted. The highway was empty, the kind of empty that only exists in rural America after midnight. No headlights, no taillights, nothing but the yellow center line disappearing into the dark and the low roar of 5 Harley engines echoing off the tree line. Leia pressed her face into Cade's back and counted her own heartbeats. 100, 200. She lost count somewhere around 300 and started over. The rhythm kept her anchored, kept her mind from spiraling into the 1,000 ways this could go wrong, kept the image of the Polaroid girl, Kayla, 11, dark hair, empty eyes, from becoming a face she failed instead of a face she saved. They killed their headlights half a mile from the property. The last stretch was gravel and mud, navigated by the faint ambient glow of a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and snow. The grain storage facility appeared as a dark mass against a darker horizon. 2 buildings, one large, one small, connected by a covered walkway. A single light burned in the smaller building's window. One vehicle parked outside, a black SUV, engine off, windows dark. One vehicle, one light. Either this was lightly guarded or it was another trap. They parked in a stand of trees 200 yards south, dismounted in silence. Cade distributed gear, flashlights, bolt cutters, the first aid kit, zip ties. Wrench carried the crowbar. Jules had a can of bear spray, which she'd described earlier with terrifying calm as the great equalizer. Bowie had the shotgun broken open, shells in his vest pocket. Mara gathered them in a tight circle. Her breath came in visible bursts. The cold was savage, the kind that finds the gaps in your clothing and drives needles into your skin. Cade and I take the main building. Wrench and Jules, the smaller one. That's where the light is. Bowie, you stay with the bikes and watch the road. If anyone comes in that isn't us, I need to know before they reach the property. She looked at Leia. You're with Wrench and Jules. If Kayla's here, she might respond better to a face that isn't covered in scars and tattoos. Nobody laughed. It wasn't a joke. 5 minutes, Mara said. In and out. If it goes sideways, we regroup at the bikes and we leave. Nobody plays hero tonight. We get the girl and we go. They moved across the field in 2 groups, bent low, the frozen grass crunching under their boots. The cold bit through Leia's jacket and into her bones, and she clenched her jaw to keep her teeth from chattering. Her eyes were locked on the smaller building, the single lit window, yellow and warm against the black. Wrench reached the door first. He pressed his ear against it, listened, nodded at Jules. Jules tried the handle. It turned. The door opened into a narrow hallway that smelled like kerosene and mildew. The light was coming from a room at the end, a door, slightly ajar, warm glow spilling through the gap. Voices, low. A television playing something Leia couldn't identify, canned laughter echoing off bare walls. Wrench moved down the hallway, Jules behind him, Leia behind Jules. Her heart was a war drum in her chest. Each step felt like walking on glass. The floor creaked, the walls breathed, and the light ahead flickered with the movement of someone passing between the television and the door. Wrench reached the door. He looked back at Jules. Jules raised the bear spray. Wrench kicked the door open. The room was small. A folding table, 2 chairs, a portable television showing a late-night rerun with the volume too low, a kerosene heater in the corner, its orange glow casting the room in warm, deceptive light. One man, seated at the table, a sandwich halfway to his mouth, his eyes going wide. He dropped the sandwich and reached for something on his belt. Jules hit him with the bear spray before his hand reached it. The man screamed, a raw, animal sound, and clawed at his face, stumbling sideways, knocking the chair over. Wrench was on him in 2 seconds. The crowbar came down on the man's wrist and something cracked, and the screaming changed pitch, and Jules was already behind him, zip-tying his hands while he writhed and gasped and cursed through swollen eyes. 30 seconds. The man was on the floor, secured, his face a mess of tears and chemical burn, his wrist bent at an angle that made Leia look away. "Where's the girl?" Wrench said. He crouched in front of the man and said it again, slower, louder, each word a separate impact. "Where is the girl?" The man coughed, spit, coughed again. "Storage room," he wheezed. "Main building. South end, gray door." Wrench was on his feet and moving before the man finished speaking. They ran. Through the hallway, out the door, across the covered walkway. The main building was larger, darker, colder. The door was padlocked. Wrench hit the lock with the crowbar 3 times and it shattered. Inside, the grain storage facility was a cavernous space. Concrete floor, metal walls, the ceiling lost in darkness above. It smelled like rust and grain dust and something chemical. Their flashlights cut through the dark, and the beams found rows of old storage bins, rusted equipment, a forklift with flat tires, and at the far south end of the building, a gray door with a new deadbolt that gleamed against the corroded metal around it. Mara and Cade emerged from the shadows on the east side. Mara was breathing hard, one hand pressed to her injured side. Cade was beside her, the shotgun at his shoulder, scanning the dark. "Clear on our end," Cade said. "1 man, restroom, handled." Wrench reached the gray door and cut the deadbolt with the bolt cutters. The metal snapped with a sound that echoed through the building like a gunshot. He pulled the door open. A small room, maybe 10 by 10. Concrete walls, a cot, a bucket. A single battery-powered lantern sitting on the floor, casting a weak circle of light that barely reached the corners. And on the cot, Curled into a ball with a thin blanket pulled over her head, was a small shape that went rigid the moment the door opened. Leia pushed past Wrench. She moved into the room slowly, hands visible, voice low. Kayla? The shape didn't move. Kayla, my name is Leia. Your dad sent me. Marcus. He sent me to bring you home. A long, terrible silence. Then the blanket moved. A face emerged, small, thin, dark hair matted and unwashed. Eyes that were too old for the face they belonged to, ringed with exhaustion, wide with the animal wariness of a child who had been lied to before and learned that kindness could be a weapon. My dad? The voice was tiny, ragged. Yeah. Leia knelt beside the cot. He's been looking for you. He's been... Her voice broke. She swallowed it down. He's waiting for you. Right now. He's waiting. Kayla stared at her. The lantern light flickered across her face, and Leia could see everything. The hollowed cheeks, the chapped lips, the way her small fingers gripped the blanket like a lifeline. 6 months. This child had been in rooms like this for 6 months, moved from place to place like cargo, fed enough to survive, kept in the dark. Is it real? Kayla whispered. Leia reached out her hand. It's real. Kayla took it. Her fingers were ice cold and impossibly small, and the moment their hands touched, the girl's composure shattered. She lunged forward and wrapped her arms around Leia's neck and buried her face in the borrowed leather jacket and made sounds that weren't words, that didn't need to be words, that were the pure, unfiltered language of a child who had been carrying a terror too large for her body and had finally found permission to let it go. Leia held her. She held her tight, and she didn't let go, and she didn't cry because crying was a luxury she couldn't afford yet. Not here. Not in this room. Not with the clock still running and the night still dark. We need to move, Cade said from the doorway. His voice was steady but urgent. The window was closing. Leia lifted Kayla. The girl weighed almost nothing, a fact that landed in Leia's chest like a physical blow. She carried her out of the room, through the building, past the rusted bins and the dead forklift, toward the exit. They were 20 feet from the door when Bowie's voice crackled through the darkness outside, sharp and flat. Truck. Coming fast. 90 seconds. Everything accelerated. Mara grabbed Leia's arm and pushed her toward the back exit. Go. The trees. Now. What about... Go. Leia ran. Kayla clung to her neck, face buried, body shaking. She hit the back door, burst into the freezing air, and sprinted across the field toward the tree line. Behind her, she heard the sounds compound. An engine roaring up the gravel road, headlights sweeping the property, doors slamming, a voice she didn't recognize shouting orders. Then Mara's voice, carrying through the dark. Get those bikes started. And Cade's voice, lower, closer to the building. Behind you, 2 more. Leia reached the tree line. The bikes were there. Bowie was already on his, engine running. She looked back and saw flashlight beams cutting across the field, from the facility, from the road, converging. 2, 3, 4 beams. Men spreading out in a pattern that looked practiced, professional, the kind of search pattern used by people who had done this before. Wrench and Jules broke from the building's east side, running hard. Wrench was limping. Something had happened in the last 90 seconds that Leia hadn't seen. Jules had his arm over her shoulder, half dragging him. They reached the bikes, and Wrench mounted up with a hiss of pain, his left leg not bending right. Mara came next, emerging from the shadows at a dead run, her hand pressed to her side, the bandage soaked through. She threw herself onto her bike, and the Heritage Softail roared to life. Cade was last. He walked, not ran, walked, out of the darkness behind the building with the shotgun across his shoulders and a look on his face that Leia would never forget. Not anger, not fear, certainty. The absolute bone-deep certainty of a man who had found his purpose and was standing inside it. Cade now! Mara shouted. He swung onto the Road King. Leia was already on the back. Kayla pressed between them. The girl's arms locked around Leia's waist. It was dangerous. 3 people on a bike built for 2, in freezing rain, on a gravel road. Everything about it was wrong, but wrong was the only direction left. The bikes tore out of the tree line and hit the road. Behind them, the facility erupted, headlights, shouting, the roar of truck engines. Someone was following. Leia could hear it, the heavy growl of a V8 gaining on them, tires throwing gravel, the distance between predator and prey shrinking with every second. Mara led the formation. She pushed her bike harder than the road allowed, leaning into turns that were barely visible, threading between potholes that could send a Harley into a ditch, the Heritage Softail responding to her commands with the loyalty of a machine that had been ridden through 1,000 storms by a woman who refused to die in any of them. The truck was closer now. Leia could see its headlights in her peripheral vision, two white eyes cutting through the dark, growing brighter, growing closer. Cade did something Leia didn't expect. He slowed. Not much, just enough to drop behind the formation, to put himself between the truck and the other bikes. He positioned the Road King in the center of the road, blocking the lane, his silhouette a wall of black leather and matte steel. "Cade," Leia said. Her voice was lost in the wind. The truck surged forward, its engine screamed. The headlights filled Leia's vision, white and blinding, and for one terrible second she was certain the truck was going to hit them, going to barrel through the bike, and the man and the girl, and the woman holding her like they were nothing, like they were debris in the road. Cade waited. He waited until the truck was 50 feet behind them. 40. 30. Then he swerved hard right, onto the shoulder, and the truck blew past in a hurricane of wind and noise, its side mirror passing so close to Cade's handlebar that Leia felt the air displacement hit her face. The truck overshot. Its brakes screamed. Red taillights flared in the dark as it fishtailed on the gravel, trying to turn, trying to come back. But the bikes were already gone. Splitting off the gravel road onto the highway, engines wide open, the formation breaking into individual streaks of speed and sound. Mara went north. Wrench and Jules went east. Bowie cut south. And Cade, with Leia and Kayla pressed against his back, took the western road, the one that led back through the dead towns and the empty highways and the frozen dark toward the compound where Edward was waiting with a reporter and a camera and the collected evidence of a dozen ordinary people who had finally decided to stop being afraid. Kayla was crying. Leia could feel it, the small shoulders heaving against her chest, the tiny fists gripping the leather jacket, the warmth of tears soaking through the fabric. Leia pressed her lips to the top of the girl's head and held on. They rode for 30 minutes. No pursuit. The truck had chosen one of the other roads, or had given up, or was circling somewhere in the dark waiting for another chance. It didn't matter. The highway was open, and the engine was loud, and the night was almost over. When the compound appeared through the trees, every light was on. The gate was open. Figures moved in the yard. And as Cade rolled the Road King through the entrance and killed the engine, the first thing Leia saw was Deacon. He stood in the center of the compound, hatless, coatless, shaking in the cold, his eyes locked on the bike with an intensity that bordered on violence. He took one step forward, then another, then he was running, a broken, lurching run, his injured shoulder forgotten, his face crumbling. Leia lifted Kayla off the bike. She set the girl on her feet. Kayla turned. She saw her father, and the sound she made, the single devastating syllable that tore out of her throat and filled the compound and echoed off the metal fences and the concrete walls, was the purest expression of human need that Leia had ever heard. "Daddy!" Deacon fell to his knees in the gravel. Kayla ran into him so hard they both nearly went over. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her into his chest and held her with the desperate, shaking grip of a man who had been slowly dying for 6 months and had just been given back the only reason he had to breathe. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He just held her and rocked and made sounds that weren't words. Leia watched from beside the bike. The cold bit her face. The wind cut through the jacket. Cade stood beside her, silent, his hands at his sides, and she could hear him breathing, slow, controlled, the breathing of a man forcing himself to hold together because holding together was the only thing he knew how to do. Then Mara pulled into the compound. Then Wrench and Jules. Then Bowie. One by one, the bikes rolled in, and the engines died and the riders dismounted into the light, bruised and bleeding and frozen and alive. Mara walked straight to the clubhouse door. Inside, visible through the window, the long table was covered in evidence. 11 witnesses sat in folding chairs. And standing beside the table, a recorder in one hand and a notebook in the other, was a woman Leia didn't recognize, sharp-featured, early 40s, wearing a press badge and an expression that said she'd been waiting a very long time for this exact night. Vivian Cross. Mara opened the door. The warm air hit her face. The room turned to look at her. The witnesses, the reporter, Edward on the couch, with a microphone clipped to his shirt. "We got her," Mara said. "She's safe." The room exhaled. Someone clapped. Someone else started crying. Gerald Briggs took off his glasses and wiped them on his flannel shirt with hands that trembled. Vivian Cross clicked her recorder on. "Start from the beginning," she said. And they did. One by one, they told their stories. The waitress who had seen trucks behind the diner, the postal worker with his logbook, the building inspector who had been fired, Gerald with his shoebox, Edward with his warehouse, Deacon with his daughter and his guilt, and the impossible choice that had turned him into something he never wanted to be. The recorder captured every word. The camera crew filmed every face. And in the harsh light of the clubhouse, under the neon signs and the bare bulbs, the silence that had protected Harlan Goss for a decade was systematically, irreversibly destroyed. Leia sat in the back of the room and watched it happen. Kayla had fallen asleep in Deacon's arms, her face pressed against his chest, her small hand gripping his shirt. Edward was speaking into the microphone, his voice steady now, his words precise, his eyes fixed on Vivian Cross with the focused intensity of a man who had survived the basement and the fear and the silence, and was finally being heard. Cade stood by the door, arms crossed, face unreadable, watching the room with the same vigilance he'd carried since the first night Leia walked in, not because the danger was over, but because he knew better than anyone that danger doesn't end. It shifts, it adapts, it waits. Outside, the first gray light of dawn crept across the compound, and somewhere in the distance a siren began to wail. The sirens multiplied. What started as a single wail became a chorus, distant at first, then closer, then close enough to rattle the windows of the clubhouse and send a ripple of tension through every person in the room. Vivian Cross paused her recorder. Gerald Briggs reached for his shotgun. Edward stood up from the couch, his face draining of color. Mara didn't move. She stood at the head of the table, one hand pressed to her bandaged side, and listened. Her eyes were closed. She was reading the sirens the way Cade read terrain, parsing direction, distance, number, intent. "Those aren't coming for us," she said. She was right. The sirens veered east, then south, following Route 11 toward the Colton Road warehouse. Then more sirens from the north, cutting toward the county line. And a third set, fainter, farther, heading in the direction of Miller Creek Road. Vivian Cross pulled out her phone. She made a call, listened for 30 seconds, and hung up. Her face had changed. The composed reporter's mask replaced by something almost electric. "State Police," she said. 6 units. They've been mobilizing since 4 this morning based on a tip from an anonymous source." She looked at Mara. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that?" Mara opened her eyes. "I know a lot of things." The tip included GPS coordinates for 3 properties, a list of names, and a detailed account of criminal activity spanning 12 years. Vivian glanced at her phone again. "The state's attorney general authorized emergency warrants an hour ago. They're hitting every location simultaneously." The room shifted. Not with relief. Relief was too clean, too simple for what these people were feeling. It was something more like vertigo. The sudden disorientation of people who had been bracing for impact and discovered that the ground beneath them was, against all odds, still holding. Leia looked at Mara. "You sent them the evidence before we left for Miller Creek." Mara met her eyes. "I sent copies. Everything Gerald had. Everything Vernon had. Everything Deacon told us about the operation." She paused. "The witnesses in this room, their testimony is for the press, for the public record. But the state needed something to move on tonight. Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight." While Goss was still scrambling to figure out how a group of bikers and a 20-year-old girl dismantled his entire network in 72 hours. "You planned both," Leia said, "the rescue and the raids, at the same time." "I planned for the only outcome that mattered. Every name on that list gets justice. Every witness gets heard, and Goss loses everything before he has a chance to run." Mara sat down slowly, carefully, the pain in her side visible in the way her jaw locked. "The press makes it public. The state makes it legal. We made it possible." Outside, the compound was bathed in the gray-blue light of early dawn. The sirens had faded into the distance, swallowed by the winter air. Snow was beginning to fall again, light this time, almost gentle, the kind that floats more than it falls. The barrel fire had burned to embers. The bikes sat in their row, chrome and leather dusted with white, engines still ticking as they cooled. Cade stepped outside. He stood in the falling snow with his head tilted back and his eyes closed, and he breathed. Just breathed. Deep, slow, the kind of breathing that soldiers learn in the spaces between engagements. Not meditation, not relaxation, but the conscious act of telling your nervous system that the immediate danger has passed, and it's permitted to stop flooding your blood with the chemicals that keep you alive but slowly destroy you from the inside. Leia watched him through the window. She was sitting on the floor beside the couch where Kayla slept, the girl's small body curled under a blanket with her head in Deacon's lap. Deacon hadn't moved in over an hour. He sat perfectly still, one hand on his daughter's hair, his eyes open but focused on nothing, or on everything, every moment of the last 6 months compressed into a single point of light, that he was staring into the way people stare into fires, searching for something they can't name. Edward sat beside Leia, their shoulders touched. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. 22 days of separation and fear and silence had stripped their relationship down to its most essential architecture. The physical fact of being next to each other, breathing the same air, occupying the same space. Everything else could wait. The next 12 hours were chaos. Controlled, necessary chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Vivienne Cross published her first piece at 7 in the morning, an online article with a headline that hit like a freight train. By 9, it had been picked up by 3 state news outlets. By noon, it was national. The names in the article were specific. The photographs were damning. The testimonies were detailed, on record, and corroborated by multiple sources. Vernon's logbook alone contained enough data to trace the operation's supply chain across 4 counties and into 3 neighboring states. The state police raids produced results that exceeded even Mara's expectations. The Colton Road warehouse yielded crates of stolen industrial equipment, falsified shipping manifests, and a financial ledger that connected the operation to 14 local businesses used as fronts for laundering money. The Miller Creek Road facility produced evidence of unlawful detention. 2 other properties, one a farmhouse north of Dalton, the other a storage unit complex near the county line, yielded additional contraband and records. Arrests began before noon. Municipal inspectors, 2 sheriff's deputies, a county clerk, a zoning board member, people whose titles had been shields, whose authority had been weaponry, whose silence had been purchased with money that came from the same trucks Edward had watched being unloaded in the dark. Harlan Goss was arrested at a gas station 60 miles south of the county line at 2 in the afternoon. He was driving a rented sedan with a briefcase full of cash and a burner phone containing messages that, according to the state attorney general's office, constituted enough evidence to ensure he would spend the rest of his natural life explaining himself to people with badges and subpoenas. Tull was found at a motel outside Dalton. He did not go quietly. 3 officers were injured in the arrest. Tull ended up in a hospital bed with a shattered kneecap and a pair of handcuffs, which several people in the county privately agreed was less than he deserved and more than he'd expected. The news spread through the town, the way news spreads through small places. Not through screens and headlines, but through conversations at the diner, at the gas station, at the grocery store checkout line. People who hadn't spoken to each other in months stood in parking lots and talked about what they'd heard and what they'd seen and what they'd known all along but never said out loud. The silence that had covered the town like a second winter began to melt, slowly and unevenly, the way snow melts when the temperature rises 1 degree at a time. But there was no celebration, not at the compound, not among the people who had made it happen, because the cost of breaking that silence was written on their bodies and in their faces, and no headline could erase what it had taken to get here. Mara spent 2 days in the hospital. The wound in her side had become infected, not badly, but enough that Jules physically blocked the clubhouse door and told her she was going to a doctor, or Jules was going to carry her there, and Mara, who had faced down armed men and corrupt officials without flinching, looked at Jules's face and decided this was not a battle worth fighting. She returned to the compound with a bottle of antibiotics, a row of stitches beneath a clean white bandage, and strict instructions to rest that everyone, including Mara, knew she would ignore. She walked into the clubhouse and found the long table cleared of evidence. Someone had cleaned the floor, Someone had fixed the flickering fluorescent light in the back aisle. A pot of fresh coffee sat on the bar beside a stack of clean mugs, and the jukebox was playing something quiet and country that Leia didn't recognize but that made the room feel, for the first time, like a place where people lived instead of a place where people survived. Wrench was in the garage, his left leg in a brace, doing something complicated to the carburetor of a bike that didn't belong to anyone in the club. Leia watched him work for a few minutes before she realized the bike was Danny Reeves, the mechanic who had fled town 3 weeks ago. Wrench was rebuilding it. Not because Danny had asked, not because anyone had asked, but because putting broken things back together was the only language Wrench had for the emotions he couldn't speak. "He'll come back," Wrench said without looking up. "When he hears what happened. He'll come back and he'll need his bike." "You think so?" "People always come back to the place where someone fixed their stuff." He tightened a bolt. "It's not about the stuff. It's about knowing somebody bothered." Jules was on the roof of the clubhouse, patching a leak that had been dripping into the back room for months. She worked alone, methodically, laying tar paper and sealant with the precision of someone who had learned that maintenance was a form of love. Below her, Bowie was repainting the compound gate where the hunting knife had been driven through the wood. He covered the hole with 3 coats of black paint and then stood back and looked at it and then added a 4th coat, because some holes take more than paint to fill. Deacon left on the 3rd day. He packed a single bag, strapped it to the back of his bike, and carried Kayla to the passenger seat. The girl was different now. Still quiet, still watchful, but the vacant, hollowed-out look in her eyes had been replaced by something cautiously alive. She held a stuffed animal that Jules had found in a thrift store in town, a small gray dog with one ear missing, and she clutched it with the focused intensity of a child relearning how to hold things without expecting them to be taken away. Mara stood at the gate and watched them prepare to leave. Deacon approached her. They stood face to face for a long time without speaking. The silence between them was thick with everything. Wren's death, the bridge, the betrayal, the grief that had driven Deacon into Goss's orbit, the impossible choice, the daughter on the back of the bike. "I can't fix this," Deacon said. "No. I need you to know that I know." Mara's voice was steady. "I know what you did and why you did it and what it cost you. I know all of it, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you it's okay because it's not. You wore our patch while you loaded their trucks. You told a man to bury evidence. You led us into a trap." She paused. "And you did it because a man took your daughter and gave you a choice that no human being should ever have to make." Deacon's eyes were red. He didn't look away. "You're out of the club," Mara said. "You know that." "I know." "But you're alive. She's alive." Mara looked at Kayla on the bike. "Take her somewhere with a good school and a yard. Get her a real dog. Let her be 11. She turned back to Deacon. "And if you ever ride through this county again, you stop. You say hello. You don't owe us that. But I'm asking." Deacon reached into his vest, the leather cut he'd worn for 20 years, faded and scarred and stitched together in places where the leather had given out. He pulled the patch from the back and held it out to Mara. She took it. She held it in her hand and looked at it. The Black Veil Rider's insignia, worn and cracked, carrying the weight of 2 decades of rides and fights and funerals and the slow, stubborn work of building something in a world that didn't want it to exist. "Ride safe," Mara said. Deacon nodded. He turned. He walked to his bike and swung on and started the engine. Kayla wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his back, the stuffed dog tucked between them. The bike pulled through the gate and onto the road, and they watched it go until the sound of the engine faded into the distance and the road was empty again. Mara stood at the gate for a long time after that. Snow fell around her. She held the patch in her hand and she didn't move, and nobody approached her, and nobody spoke, because there are moments when the only appropriate response to another person's grief is distance. Cade was the one who finally went to her. He walked across the compound and stood beside her at the gate. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He just stood there, solid and present, the way he had stood outside Leia's bedroom door as a child. Not entering, not intruding, just existing in proximity, as a reminder that solitude and isolation are not the same thing. "He used Ren," Mara said quietly. "Goss used my son's death to turn Deacon into a weapon. He took the worst night of our lives, and he built a trap out of it." "Yeah, and the worst part isn't the betrayal. The worst part is that if someone told me they could prove Ren's crash wasn't an accident, if someone told me they had names and dates and evidence, I'd have done the same thing Deacon did. I would have loaded those trucks myself. Cade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not the worst part." Mara looked at him. "The worst part is that you already know Goss was lying. There's no evidence because there's nothing to find. Ren hit black ice on a cold night, that's all. And Goss took that truth and turned it into a weapon because the only thing more powerful than a lie is a lie that a grieving person wants to believe." Mara's face crumbled, not dramatically, not the way faces crumble in movies with tears and trembling lips. It was quieter than that, more devastating. The controlled collapse of a structure that had been holding too long, a microfracture that traveled from her eyes to her jaw to her shoulders, releasing something she had been carrying for 2 years with the focused discipline of a woman who believed that if she ever set it down, she would never pick herself back up. Cade caught her when her knees bent. He put his arms around her, carefully, slowly, the way you hold something fragile and valuable. And Mara leaned into him and let the weight transfer. Not all of it. Not forever. Just enough. Just for now. They stood like that at the gate while the snow fell and the compound was quiet, and the world, for one brief moment, stopped asking them to be anything other than two tired people holding each other up. The days that followed were strange and slow. The town didn't transform overnight. It didn't suddenly become safe, or prosperous, or kind. The diner still had cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during a previous administration. The roads were still potholed. The factories were still closed. The library still had a leaking roof and flickering lights. But things shifted. Incrementally. Imperfectly. The way things shift when the pressure that's been holding them in place is finally removed. Connie Faust opened her door. Not all the way. She kept the chain on for the first week, talking to visitors through the gap. But she opened it. And on the second week, the chain came off. And on the third week, she walked to the diner for breakfast and sat in a booth by the window and drank coffee while the morning light came through the glass, and she didn't look over her shoulder once. Danny Reeves came back. Wrench was right. He came back for his bike, and he came back because someone had scrubbed the word snitch off his shop door and repainted it clean. He never found out who did it. Bowie never told him. The county held emergency elections for the positions vacated by the arrests. The new sheriff was a woman named Torres, who had worked highway patrol for 15 years, and whose first official act was to drive to the Black Veil Riders' compound and knock on the gate. Mara met her in the yard. They talked for an hour. Nobody overheard the conversation, but when Torres left, she shook Mara's hand, and Mara watched her drive away with an expression that might, under the right light, have been mistaken for hope. Vernon's logbook became a key piece of evidence in the state's case. The retired postal worker was interviewed by 3 different news outlets and became, briefly and uncomfortably, a minor public figure. He handled it with the quiet dignity of a man who had never wanted attention, but understood that sometimes attention was the price of truth. Gerald Briggs' hardware store saw more business in the month following the arrest than it had in the previous 2 years combined. People came to buy things they didn't need, a box of nails, a roll of tape, a pair of work gloves, because buying something from Gerald's store had become an act of solidarity, a small way of saying, "I see what you did, and it mattered." Gerald never acknowledged it directly. He just rang up the purchases and nodded, and sometimes, when the customer wasn't looking, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Leia spent 2 weeks at the compound before she was ready to leave. Not because she was afraid to go, but because leaving meant returning to a world that had failed her, and she needed time to decide whether she could forgive it enough to live in it again. She spent her mornings in the garage with Cade, handing him tools while he worked on bikes, learning the names of engine parts and the logic of machines. Cade didn't teach her the way a teacher teaches, with explanations and patience and structured lessons. He taught her the way veterans teach, by doing, by demonstrating, by placing the right tool in her hand at the right moment, and trusting her to figure out the rest. On her last morning, she found him in the garage alone, sitting on the workbench with a mug of coffee, staring at the Road King. "You rode that at 80 miles an hour in the dark," he said, "first time on a motorcycle." "It wasn't my best decision." "It was exactly the right decision." He took a sip of coffee. "Wrong technique, terrible form. You nearly dropped it twice on the highway, and you took the compound turn too wide by about 4 feet." He paused. "But you stayed on. You kept the throttle open, and you got the girl home. Kayla got home because of everyone, not just me. Everyone includes you. Cade set down the mug. He reached into the saddlebag of the Road King and pulled out something small, a key attached to a leather fob stamped with the Road King's model year. He held it out. Leia stared at it. I can't take your bike. It's not a gift, it's a loan. You learn to ride it properly. You put miles on it. You bring it back when you're ready. He looked at her. And you come back. That's the condition. You come back. She took the key. It was warm from the saddlebag, small and solid in her palm, and it carried a weight that had nothing to do with metal. Thank you, she said. For everything. Cade nodded. He picked up his coffee. Conversation over. But as Leia turned to leave, he said one more thing. Quiet. Almost to himself. The kind of thing people say when they've been carrying it for a long time, and the weight has finally become unbearable. Ren would have liked you. Leia stopped. She didn't turn around. She stood in the garage doorway with the snow falling outside and the key in her hand and the echo of a dead man's name in the air. And she understood that what Cade had just given her wasn't a compliment. It was the highest form of trust a man like him was capable of. The admission that she had been measured against the memory of someone he loved, and she had not been found wanting. She walked out into the snow. Mara was waiting by the gate. She looked better. Not healed, not fully, maybe not ever, but standing straighter, breathing easier. The color returned to her face. The stitches in her side would leave a scar. She had enough scars that one more made no practical difference. But Leia had noticed that Mara touched this one sometimes, absently, the way people touch things they're still deciding how to feel about. Edward's waiting, Mara said. I know. You've got my number. You call if you need anything, day or night. I mean that. I know you do. Mara looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached out and straightened the collar of the leather jacket Leia was still wearing. Cade's jacket, the one she'd put on 3 days ago in a garage before dawn. The one that still smelled like road dust and engine oil and the specific, indefinable scent of a life lived at high speed on the margins. Keep it, Mara said. It fits you better than it ever fit him. Leia hugged her. She didn't plan it. It wasn't a decision. Her body simply moved, and her arms went around Mara, and Mara's arms went around her, and they held each other in the falling snow with the compound behind them and the highway ahead. Mara held on tight, tighter than Leia expected, tighter than the wound in her side should have allowed. And for a moment the older woman's composure slipped, and Leia felt her breath hitch against her shoulder. Then Mara let go. She stepped back. She straightened her jacket and lifted her chin and became once again the woman who ran the Black Veil Riders with steady hands and unreadable eyes. Ride safe, Mara said. Edward was outside the gate, sitting on a borrowed motorcycle, one of the club's spare bikes, a smaller Harley Sportster that Wrench had tuned and serviced and pronounced roadworthy with the solemnity of a man issuing a medical clearance. Edward looked strange on it, not uncomfortable exactly, but new, like a word being used in a sentence for the first time. He wore a jacket that Bowie had given him, and boots that Jules had found in the storage room, and a helmet that Wrench had painted flat black because Wrench believed that unpainted helmets were an aesthetic offense, and he was willing to die on that hill. You ready? Edward asked. Leia looked at him. Her brother, the boy who sat outside her bedroom door, the man who vanished to keep her safe, the witness who spoke into a microphone and helped bring down an operation that had been crushing people for a decade. He was still thin, still tired, but something had come back into his eyes. Not the old thing, not the easy, uncomplicated confidence of before. Something harder, more expensive. The look of a person who has been broken and has chosen, deliberately, against all evidence and expectation, to rebuild. She swung her leg over the Road King. The engine caught on the first try, and the deep rolling thunder of it vibrated through her body and into the cold morning air. She gripped the handlebars, wider than her hands, heavier than anything she'd held before, and felt the machine respond to her touch with the patient, powerful obedience of something that would take her anywhere she wanted to go, as long as she had the nerve to ask. Yeah, she said softly. Let's go home. They pulled onto the highway side by side. The snow had stopped. The sky was the color of old silver, low and heavy, but there was light behind it. Not sunlight exactly, but the suggestion of sunlight, the promise that somewhere above the clouds the sky was still blue, and the world was still turning. The compound grew smaller behind them. The neon signs, dark in the daylight, faded into the gray. The metal fences disappeared into the tree line. And standing at the gate, growing smaller with every second, were the silhouettes of people who had been written off by the world and had answered by building something the world couldn't ignore. Not a gang, not an army, but a family. Imperfect, damaged, held together with scar tissue and engine grease and the stubborn, unreasonable refusal to let the people around them face the dark alone. Laya leaned into the wind. The highway stretched ahead, long and straight, and covered in the thin, shimmering film of melted snow that made the asphalt look like water. The Road King hummed beneath her, steady and sure. Edward rode beside her, close enough to see, far enough to breathe. She didn't look back. Not because she didn't care, but because the people behind her had taught her something that no library book and no police report and no system had ever bothered to explain. That sometimes the safest place in the world isn't the one with the strongest walls. It's the one where someone stays. Where someone answers the door at midnight, where someone hands you a jacket that's too big and a helmet with a crack in it and says, "Hold on," and means it. The highway opened, the engines sang. The winter wind cut across the road and carried with it the faintest trace of something Laya hadn't smelled in months, wood smoke and coffee, and the sharp, clean bite of cold air moving through a town that was learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to wake up. Behind them, the neon signs of the Black Veil Riders' compound flickered once in the gray light and went still. Ahead, the road went on,